Vikings buried their babies alive every winter, and it saved their lives. While you'd freeze to death in minutes, entire Viking families thrived in temperatures that would kill modern humans instantly. How did children who couldn't even walk survive when grown adults today need heated homes just to sleep? When winter rolled around in medieval Scandinavia, it wasn't just cold weather arriving at your doorstep. It was 6 months of darkness, bone-chilling temperatures, and winds that could literally knock you off your feet. We're talking about a survival challenge that would make modern winter camping look like a cozy weekend getaway. The sheer length of these winters catches most people off guard. 6 full months. That's half the year when stepping outside could kill you if you weren't properly prepared. From October through March, Viking families had to hunker down and rely entirely on what they'd managed to gather and store during the brief summer months. No grocery stores, no heating systems, no emergency services coming to rescue you if things went wrong. Then there's the cold itself. Modern thermometers would regularly dip below -20 degrees Celsius in the remote areas where many Viking families lived. But here's what makes it even worse. Most of these families lived far from large towns or settlements. You couldn't just walk over to your neighbor's house if your fire went out or your food stores ran low. Some families were completely isolated for months at a time, with the nearest help potentially days away through treacherous snow-covered terrain. The darkness was perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect. In northern settlements, the sun would barely peek above the horizon for 4 hours a day, if it appeared at all. For 20 hours, families lived in near-complete darkness. Children grew up knowing that winter meant living by firelight and candlelight for months on end. Adults had to time their essential outdoor tasks around those precious few hours of dim daylight, often working in conditions that were more like twilight than proper daylight. Wind presented another deadly challenge that's often overlooked. Scandinavian winter winds regularly howled at over 50 kilometers per hour, creating whiteout conditions that could disorient even experienced adults within minutes of leaving their homes. These weren't gentle breezes, they were powerful enough to blow snow horizontally, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Vikings learned to recognize the sound of approaching storm winds, and would sometimes tie ropes between their houses and barns to avoid getting lost in their own yards during blizzards. The combination of these factors created a survival scenario that required months of preparation and incredible resilience. One bad decision, one inadequately prepared food store, one poorly maintained fire could mean the difference between making it to spring and not surviving at all. Viking children learned from their earliest years that winter was not a season to take lightly. It was an opponent that demanded respect, preparation, and constant vigilance. What made this even more challenging was the unpredictability. Some winters arrived early, catching families before they'd finished their preparations. Other winters lingered well into what should have been spring, stretching already thin food supplies to their absolute limits. Weather patterns could shift dramatically within hours, turning a manageable cold day into a life-threatening blizzard. Viking families also had to deal with the psychological toll of isolation and darkness. Cabin fever wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a real threat to family harmony and mental health. Imagine being confined to a single room with your entire extended family for months, with only brief breaks to venture outside for essential tasks. The strongest family bonds could be tested to their breaking point during these long, dark months. The remote locations where many Vikings lived added another layer of complexity. While towns might have offered some mutual support and shared resources, families living in outlying areas had to be completely self-sufficient. They couldn't rely on anyone else for help, and they couldn't afford to make mistakes. Every aspect of winter survival fell entirely on their own shoulders. But here's the remarkable part. Not only did these families survive these brutal conditions year after year, they actually thrived. They developed sophisticated strategies for staying warm, well-fed, and mentally healthy throughout the long winter months. They created systems for food storage, heating, clothing, and even entertainment that allowed them to maintain their strength and spirits until spring returned. The techniques they developed weren't just about surviving, they were about maintaining enough energy and health to resume their active lives when warmer weather returned. Viking men needed to be ready for farming, trading, and sometimes raiding once spring arrived. Women had to be prepared for the intensive work of the growing season. Children had to continue learning and developing, even during the dark months. Understanding how Vikings faced these winter challenges gives us insight into their incredible resilience and resourcefulness. However, surviving these conditions required careful planning and preparation that began months before the first snow fell. When summer warmth still kissed the Scandinavian landscape, Viking families were already thinking about death, not their own. Though that was always a possibility, but the slow, grinding death that winter brought to the unprepared. Smart Vikings knew that surviving those brutal 6-month winters wasn't about being tough when the snow started falling. It was about being obsessively prepared months before the first frost appeared. Late summer was crunch time. While other civilizations might have enjoyed the final warm days, Vikings turned into survival machines. Every sunny day represented another chance to gather, preserve and stockpile what would keep them alive when temperatures plummeted below -20 degrees Celsius. The work was backbreaking, but the alternative was starvation. Meat preservation became an art form that would make modern food scientists jealous. Vikings couldn't just throw their protein in a freezer and call it done. They had to turn fresh meat into something that wouldn't rot over 6 months of storage. Smoking was their favorite technique. Thin strips of beef, pork and venison hung over carefully maintained fires for days. The smoke didn't just add flavor, it created a protective barrier against bacteria that could spoil their winter lifeline. Salt was Viking gold for good reason. They rubbed it deep into large cuts of meat, drawing out moisture that bacteria needed to multiply. Salted meat could last months if stored properly, and every family hoarded salt like their lives depended on it. Because they did. Then there's the drying process. Imagine beef jerky, but your survival depends on getting it right. Vikings sliced meat paper thin and hung it on wooden racks in well-ventilated areas. Wind and sun worked together to remove every drop of moisture. Properly dried meat became hard as leather, but could sustain a person through the darkest winter days. Root cellars were the Vikings' secret weapon against winter's stranglehold. These weren't just holes in the ground, they were carefully engineered food storage systems. Dug deep enough to stay cool but not freeze, these underground chambers kept vegetables fresh for months. Turnips, carrots, onions and cabbages went into these earthen vaults like treasure in a bank. The construction of root cellars reveals Viking ingenuity. Stone-lined walls prevented cave-ins while allowing proper drainage. Wooden shelving kept vegetables organized and off the damp ground. Thick wooden doors sealed with animal fat kept the cold out while maintaining the perfect storage temperature inside. Modern refrigerators work on similar principles, just with electricity instead of earth. Firewood gathering turned entire families into logging crews. Adults wielded axes while children collected smaller branches and kindling. Every piece of wood was precious because running out of fuel in January meant freezing to death. Vikings needed several tons of firewood per family. That's roughly equivalent to a modern car's weight in wood, all gathered and split by hand. But smart Vikings didn't stop at wood. They collected anything that would burn. Dried peat from bogs made excellent fuel that burned slow and hot. Animal dung, once dried, provided emergency heat when wood supplies ran low. Corn cobs, dried grass and even pine cones found their way into fuel stockpiles. The Vikings' philosophy was simple: if it burns, collect it. Food preservation extended beyond meat into every edible resource. Wild berries were dried into concentrated nutrition bombs. Mushrooms were strung up like Christmas decorations to air dry. Fish received special treatment, cleaned, salted and hung to become stockfish so hard it could last years without spoiling. Norse housewives became chemistry experts, knowing exactly how much salt, smoke time and drying duration each food type required. Dairy products demanded their own preservation techniques. Summer milk became winter cheese through careful aging processes. Butter was packed in wooden containers and buried in cool places to prevent rancidity. Fermented dairy products like skyr provided crucial nutrients and probiotics that kept Viking digestive systems functioning during months of preserved food consumption. The psychological pressure of winter preparation was enormous. Families who miscalculated their needs faced genuine starvation. There were no grocery stores, no emergency services, no backup plans. Running out of food in February meant watching your children grow thin and weak while you searched desperately for anything edible under the snow. Successful winter preparation required mathematical precision that would impress modern accountants. How much meat per person per day? How many logs burned in an average week? What percentage extra to store for unusually harsh weather? Vikings who survived multiple winters developed these calculations through hard-won experience and shared them with younger family members like sacred knowledge. The work never seemed to end during preparation season. Dawn to dusk labor became the norm as families raced against time. Women worked alongside men in the fields and preservation areas. Children contributed according to their abilities, learning skills that would determine their own survival in future years. Community cooperation made the difference between success and disaster. Neighbors shared knowledge about the best preservation techniques. helped each other with large tasks, and sometimes pooled resources for expensive items like salt. These summer preparation bonds would prove crucial when winter's isolation set in. Well, all this frantic preparation had one goal: keeping families alive inside homes specifically designed to battle Scandinavian winter's worst attacks. After months of preparation, Vikings faced a brutal reality. The best food storage and warmest clothes meant nothing if your house couldn't keep the cold out. Building a winter-worthy home wasn't just construction, it was survival engineering. Viking longhouses looked nothing like the wooden cabins you might expect. These weren't quick weekend projects or simple log structures. Every single design choice had one purpose: keeping a family alive when temperatures dropped to bone-chilling extremes. The foundation started with stone. Large flat rocks created a base that wouldn't shift when the ground froze and thawed repeatedly. Vikings knew that a wobbly house in winter meant cracks where deadly cold air could sneak in. Smart builders placed these stones carefully, creating drainage so melting snow wouldn't pool around the walls. Then came the wood frame. Vikings used whatever trees they could find: oak, pine, birch. But here's where it gets interesting. They didn't just chop down trees and start hammering. The wood had to be seasoned properly, meaning dried for months or even years. Green wood would warp and crack in extreme cold, creating gaps that could literally freeze a family to death. The walls were the real genius part. Vikings didn't rely on wood alone, because they understood something modern builders sometimes forget: mass equals thermal protection. They built thick walls using a sandwich technique. The outer layer was wood planks. The inner layer was more wood, but between them, packed earth, stones and whatever insulating material they could find. The secret weapon was turf. Yes, chunks of grass and dirt. Vikings cut thick pieces of turf like giant green bricks and stacked them against the outer walls. This wasn't just because they ran out of other materials. Turf is an incredible insulator. It breathes but blocks wind. It's waterproof but not completely sealed. And when it freezes, it becomes even more solid. Roofs had to handle serious business. We're talking about snow loads that could collapse poorly built structures. Viking roofs were steep, not for looks but for physics. Snow slides off steep angles instead of piling up and crushing everything below. They used overlapping wooden planks covered with more turf, creating a living roof that actually got better at insulation as grass grew on top. But wait, there's more to this roof situation. Vikings cut a hole right in the center for smoke to escape from their central fire. This sounds crazy until you realize they had no chimneys. The smoke hole had a wooden cover they could adjust depending on wind and weather. Too big and heat escaped. Too small and everyone choked on smoke. Doors were ridiculously low. Not because Vikings were short, though many were smaller than modern people, but because low doors created an airlock effect. Cold air stays low, warm air rises. A tiny door opening meant less heat loss every time someone went in or out. Plus, a heavy wooden door with thick leather hinges could be barred shut against both human enemies and howling winds. Windows barely existed. When they did appear, they were tiny openings covered with thin animal membrane or oiled cloth. Glass was incredibly rare and expensive. Most families lived in near darkness during winter months, relying on firelight for everything. The few windows that existed were more like peepholes, just enough to see what was happening outside without letting precious heat escape. The floor design mattered more than you'd think. Vikings often dug down slightly, creating a sunken living area. Warm air naturally settles in lower spaces. They covered the dirt floor with wooden planks, rushes, or anything that provided insulation from the cold ground below. Some families kept animals in attached sections, using their body heat as a natural heating system. Interior walls divided the longhouse into sections. The family lived in the center section, where the hearth burned. Storage areas and animal spaces occupied the ends. This layout created heat zones, warmest in the middle, cooler toward the edges. It also meant that if one section got damaged, the family could retreat to another area while making repairs. Every joint and seam was carefully sealed. Vikings used a mixture of clay, moss, and animal hair to fill gaps. They knew that even tiny cracks would let in enough cold air to make the difference between comfort and misery. Women and children spent time before each winter checking for new gaps and plugging them immediately. The most successful Viking families often spent summers not just gathering food but actually improving their houses. Adding another layer of turf, replacing worn wood sections, strengthening the roof supports. A house was never truly finished. It was always being upgraded for the next winter challenge. These weren't just buildings. They were carefully engineered survival pods, designed by people who knew that one mistake in construction could mean death for an entire family. But even the best house was useless without heat, and keeping a fire burning through months of brutal weather required its own special knowledge and skills. Picture walking into a Viking longhouse on a winter night. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight, it's the warmth radiating from a crackling fire in the center of the room. That open hearth wasn't just a luxury, it was literally the difference between life and death. The hearth dominated everything. Built right into the floor, this stone-lined fire pit sat smack in the middle of the main living area. No fancy fireplace with a proper chimney here, just an open flame surrounded by carefully placed stones, with smoke drifting upward toward a hole cut in the roof above. Simple, absolutely. Effective, you bet your frozen toes it was. But here's where things get tricky. Vikings couldn't just toss wood on the fire whenever they felt chilly. Remember all that preparation from summer and fall? Well, now comes the payoff, or the brutal reality check. Each piece of firewood represented precious survival time. Run out too early, and your family faces months of bone-crushing cold with no backup plan. The fire burned almost continuously through the winter months. Notice I said, almost. Vikings developed an art form around banking their fires at night. They'd cover the coals with ash, creating a slow burn that kept some heat going without wasting wood. Come morning, a few pokes and some dry kindling brought the flames roaring back to life. Miss this technique, and you're starting from scratch with flint and steel in a freezing house. Everyone's daily routine revolved around that central flame. The hearth served as kitchen, heater, light source, and social hub all rolled into one. Families arranged their entire living space in concentric circles around the fire. Sleeping areas closest to the warmth, workspaces just far enough away to avoid sparks. Storage areas pushed to the coldest edges where frozen food stayed fresh. Then there's the smoke situation. Modern people would probably choke to death in 5 minutes, but Vikings adapted to living in what was essentially a controlled smoky haze. The roof hole let most smoke escape, but plenty lingered inside. This wasn't entirely bad news. The smoke helped preserve meat hanging from the rafters and kept insects away. Still, Viking lungs must have been tough as leather. Women typically managed the hearth, but this wasn't some quaint domestic duty. The firekeeper held one of the most crucial survival roles in the household. She decided when to add wood, how much to burn overnight, and whether the family could afford to keep cooking fires going during the day. One miscalculation could doom everyone. Wood quality mattered enormously. Hardwoods like oak and birch burned longer and hotter than softer woods. Vikings learned which trees gave the best coals for overnight banking, and which caught fire quickly for morning restarts. Pine and fir worked fine for getting flames going, but they burned fast and created more smoke. Dry wood was gold, wet wood meant wasted fuel and dangerous smoke buildup. The positioning of that central hearth wasn't random either. Viking builders calculated airflow patterns inside their longhouses. Cold air entered through the doorway, got heated by the fire, then rose to escape through the roof hole. This created a circulation system that moved warm air throughout the house. Mess up the hearth placement, and you'd have dead air pockets where family members froze despite a roaring fire just feet away. Managing the fire became a 24-hour responsibility shared among family members. Someone always kept watch, especially during fierce blizzards when wind could blow snow down through the roof hole and threaten to extinguish the flames. Older children learned to tend the fire as one of their first major responsibilities. Adult family members took shifts during the longest, coldest nights. The psychological impact of that constant flame can't be overstated. In a world where darkness lasted 20 hours and temperatures dropped deadly low, the hearth represented hope, safety, and life itself. Families gathered around it to eat, work, tell stories, and simply stay sane during the endless winter months. The crackling flames and glowing coals provided the only moving, changing thing in an otherwise frozen, static world. Vikings even developed superstitions around hearth management. Letting the fire die completely brought bad luck. The way flames danced supposedly predicted weather changes. Certain rituals around lighting the fire honored the gods who controlled winter's harshness. But what happened when families miscalculated their wood supply or faced an unusually long winter? The answer reveals just how desperate things could get. And it connects directly to another crucial survival strategy Vikings used when the hearth alone wasn't enough to keep them alive through the brutal months ahead. When you're facing 6 months of brutal Scandinavian winter, your clothing becomes your armor. Vikings understood this better than anyone. While modern people complain about wearing a heavy jacket, Vikings wrapped themselves in layers that would make a modern winter enthusiast jealous. But here's the thing that might surprise you. Their secret weapon wasn't some exotic material or advanced technology, it was sheep. Wool became the backbone of Viking winter survival, and for good reason. This stuff works like magic when temperatures plummet below freezing. Unlike cotton, which becomes useless when wet, wool keeps you warm even when it's soaking. The fibers trap air in tiny pockets, creating insulation that doesn't quit. Vikings figured this out centuries before anyone understood the science behind it. But getting from sheep to survival gear wasn't simple. Every piece of woolen clothing represented hours of backbreaking work. Women spent entire days spinning raw wool into yarn, their fingers working constantly by firelight. The spinning wheel hadn't been invented yet, so they used simple drop spindles, basically a stick with a weight. Slow work, but it got the job done. Then came the weaving. Viking women worked on large wooden looms, creating fabric that would literally keep their families alive. They couldn't just pop into a store and grab a sweater when winter hit. Every thread mattered. Every piece of cloth was precious. Mess up the weaving and someone might freeze. The clothing itself tells an interesting story about Viking practicality. They didn't worry about fashion trends or looking stylish. Function ruled everything. Men wore thick woolen tunics that reached their knees with long sleeves that could be pulled down over their hands when needed. Over this went woolen trousers, often reinforced at the knees where wear was heaviest. Women's clothing followed similar principles but with their own clever adaptations. Long woolen dresses provided coverage and warmth, while thick cloaks could be wrapped around children or used as extra bedding. These weren't delicate garments, they were built for survival, heavy, practical, and designed to last through the harshest conditions nature could throw at them. Layering became an art form. Vikings didn't just throw on one thick garment and call it good. They understood that multiple thin layers trap more air and provide better insulation than one bulky piece. Underwear made from fine wool went on first, followed by increasingly thick outer layers. Smart system, really. The colors might surprise you too. While Hollywood loves to show Vikings in drab browns and grays, they actually had access to surprisingly vibrant dyes. Red from madder root, blue from woad, yellow from various plants. These weren't just for decoration, bright colors helped people spot each other in blizzards. Practical and pretty at the same time. Hats deserve special mention here. Heat escapes fastest through your head, and Vikings knew this instinctively. Their woolen caps were thick, often with flaps that could be pulled down over ears and necks. Some were so large they looked almost comical. But nobody was laughing when the temperature dropped to 20 below zero. Mittens presented an interesting challenge. You need your hands for work, but exposed fingers freeze quickly in extreme cold. Viking women solved this by knitting mittens with a special design, thick wool for warmth, but with sections that could be folded back to expose fingertips when detailed work was needed. Clever compromise between function and survival. Let's not forget the socks and leg wrappings. Vikings didn't have modern boots with insulation, so they relied on thick woolen socks and long strips of wool that wrapped around their legs like primitive leggings. These went under and over their leather shoes, creating multiple layers of protection against snow and cold. The really impressive part was how they maintained all this clothing. Wool needs care, especially when it's getting daily use in harsh conditions. Women constantly mended, cleaned and retreated the fabric. A torn cloak wasn't just an inconvenience, it could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Children's clothing required extra attention. Kids grow fast, so woolen garments had to be made with room to expand or easy ways to add length. Hand-me-downs weren't just economical, they were essential for family survival. Every scrap of wool fabric got used somehow. Sheep then weren't just livestock to the Vikings. They were partners in survival. Each animal represented warmth, protection, and life itself. Losing sheep to disease or predators meant real trouble come winter. Families counted their wool stores as carefully as their food supplies. The amount of wool needed for one family staggers the imagination. Multiple complete outfits for each person, plus extras for repairs and replacement. Blankets, cloaks, socks, mittens, hats, the list goes on. One harsh winter could wear out clothing that took months to create. But wool alone wasn't enough for the truly brutal conditions. When temperatures really plummeted and the wind picked up, Vikings needed something even more protective. That's where animal furs and leather came into play, adding another crucial layer to their survival strategy. Winter clothing was just the beginning. Vikings needed something tougher, something that could handle the absolute worst conditions nature could throw at them. Wool was great, but when you're trudging through knee-deep snow or sleeping on frozen ground, you need serious backup. Animal fur became their secret weapon against the cold. Every single scrap of animal skin that came into a Viking household had a purpose. Nothing got wasted. When they hunted deer, trapped rabbits, or slaughtered livestock, the meat fed the family, but the hide, that's what kept them alive when temperatures dropped below what any human should reasonably survive. Reindeer fur was pure gold in the Viking world. These animals lived in the same brutal conditions Vikings faced, so their thick, hollow-haired coats were perfectly designed for extreme cold. A reindeer hide could line the inside of boots, creating a warm pocket that trapped body heat. The fur was so effective that even when snow melted and seeped through leather, feet stayed warm and dry underneath. Fox pelts were another prize catch. Fox fur is incredibly dense. We're talking about thousands of individual hairs packed into every square inch. Vikings used fox fur to line the inside of hats and hoods, creating a warm buffer around their heads and necks. Losing body heat through your head in winter isn't just uncomfortable, it can kill you. Fox fur prevented that heat loss better than anything else they had access to. Bear skins were the ultimate luxury, though hunting bears was obviously dangerous business. A single bear hide could serve as a blanket for an entire family. These massive pelts were thick enough to lay directly on cold ground and still provide insulation. Families would spread bear skins over their sleeping areas, creating a warm barrier between their bodies and the frozen earth below. Then there's leather, the unsung hero of Viking winter survival. While fur provided insulation, leather gave them protection and durability. Viking leather workers, mostly women, became incredibly skilled at preparing hides. They had to scrape away every bit of flesh and fat, then treat the skin with special mixtures to keep it flexible. Here's where it gets interesting. Untreated leather turns stiff as a board in cold weather. Imagine trying to walk in boots that feel like wooden blocks, or wearing mittens that won't bend with your fingers. Vikings solved this by using animal brains and oils to treat their leather. Sounds gross, but it worked perfectly. The treated leather stayed soft and flexible, even in freezing temperatures. Boots were their most critical leather item. Viking boots weren't just simple shoes, they were complex survival tools. The outer layer was thick, waterproofed leather that could handle snow, mud, and ice. Inside, they lined them with fur or wool for insulation. Some boots even had multiple layers, with different furs serving different purposes. Mittens got the same treatment. Vikings couldn't afford to lose fingers to frostbite. They needed their hands for everything from chopping wood to handling tools. Leather mittens with fur lining kept hands warm while still allowing enough dexterity to work. Smart Vikings kept extra pairs, because wet mittens in winter could mean trouble. The process of preparing these hides was intense work that happened year-round. Women would stretch fresh hides on wooden frames, scraping them clean with specially made tools. The smell was absolutely terrible. Imagine the worst thing you've ever smelled, then multiply it by 10. But families put up with it because properly prepared fur and leather meant the difference between life and death. Storage was crucial too. Furs and leather had to be kept dry and protected from insects. Vikings built special storage areas where they could hang treated hides away from moisture. Moths and other bugs could destroy months of work in just a few weeks, so they used strong-smelling herbs and smoke to keep pests away. Every family member had specific fur and leather items. Babies got the softest, warmest furs closest to their skin. Children received hand-me-down items that still had plenty of life left. Adults got the most durable pieces that could handle heavy outdoor work. Even the family's sleeping arrangements involved layers of different furs and hides. The really smart families traded fur and leather with their neighbors. Maybe one family was better at trapping foxes, while another excelled at preparing reindeer hides. Trading allowed everyone to get the best possible materials for their specific needs. What's amazing is how Vikings managed to stay warm in conditions that would send modern people running for the nearest heated building. Their combination of fur-lined everything and properly treated leather created a personal heating system that worked without any external power source. But staying warm was only part of the winter survival challenge. Even with the best furs and leather, Vikings still needed to solve another critical problem: how to sleep through those brutal nights when temperatures dropped dangerously low, and staying alive meant sharing every bit of available warmth. Picture a modern family of 4 trying to squeeze into a twin bed every night for 6 months. Sounds like a nightmare, right? Well, for Viking families, cramming everyone together wasn't just about saving space. It was literally the difference between waking up alive or freezing to death in their sleep. Viking sleeping arrangements would make today's parents absolutely lose their minds. Entire families, sometimes including grandparents, aunts, uncles, and even trusted servants, all shared the same sleeping area. We're talking about 8 to 12 people huddled together like a pile of puppies. Privacy? That wasn't even a word in their vocabulary during winter months. The sleeping platforms themselves were basically wooden frames built low to the ground, usually running along the walls of the longhouse. Think of them as the world's first king-size bed, except it was made from rough-hewn planks and stretched nearly the entire length of the room. These platforms were stuffed with straw mattresses that got flattened pretty quickly under the weight of so many bodies. But here's where things get interesting. The straw wasn't just random grass thrown together. Viking families carefully selected specific types of dried grasses and reeds that provided the best insulation. They'd mix in sweet-smelling herbs when they could find them, because let's be honest, when you're sleeping next to your sweaty uncle for half the year, you want all the natural air fresheners you can get. The blanket situation was where Vikings really showed their survival smarts. Heavy woolen blankets formed the base layer, woven so thick they could practically stand up on their own. Then came the animal skins, reindeer hides, bear pelts, fox furs, whatever they could hunt or trade for. The richest families might have had elaborate fur coverlets that would make today's luxury bedding look pathetic. Children always got positioned in the middle of the sleeping arrangement, not because they were spoiled, but because their small bodies lost heat fastest. Grandparents, despite their age, often slept on the outer edges because their experience helped them monitor the fire and listen for dangers during the night. The adults formed a protective barrier between the cold walls and the most vulnerable family members. Body heat mathematics played out every single night. Each person generated roughly the same warmth as a 75-watt light bulb. Doesn't sound like much until you multiply that by 10 people all pressed together under insulating layers. The combined heat could raise the temperature under those blankets by 15-20 degrees compared to the freezing air just a few feet away. Then there's the question everyone's wondering about. How did they handle, well, bathroom situations? Viking families used chamber pots made from wood or clay, usually kept near the sleeping area because venturing outside in the middle of a blizzard could literally kill you. Some families had designated pot duty that rotated between older children and adults. Sleep schedules operated completely differently than ours, with only 4 hours of week daylight during the worst winter months. Vikings often slept in shifts. Some family members would stay awake to tend the fire while others rested. Then they'd switch. This meant the sleeping pile was constantly shifting and rearranging throughout the night. The smell situation was exactly what you'd expect. Pretty rough by modern standards, but Vikings had clever solutions. They'd place small bundles of juniper branches or other aromatic plants around the sleeping area. Some families even kept certain herbs burning in small clay bowls to help mask the inevitable odors of so many unwashed bodies pressed together for months. Snoring must have been epic in these situations. Can you imagine trying to sleep while your grandfather, 3 uncles, and assorted cousins are all sawing logs in different rhythms? Vikings actually developed sleeping positions and arrangements designed to minimize noise. Side sleeping was preferred, and the loudest snorers got banished to the far end of the platform. Personal space was a luxury no one could afford. Families developed unspoken rules about movement during sleep. Rolling over required a coordinated effort so you didn't accidentally knee someone in the ribs or steal someone else's share of the covers. Children learned to sleep motionless from a very young age. The really fascinating part is how this forced intimacy actually strengthened family bonds. When you literally depend on your relative's body heat to survive the night, family feuds get put on hold pretty quickly. These sleeping arrangements created incredibly tight-knit family units that could cooperate under extreme stress. But staying warm through the night was only half the battle. When you're burning through thousands of calories just to maintain body temperature, and when stepping outside could mean instant frostbite, the question becomes, how did these families actually fuel their bodies for survival? What they ate during those brutal months reveals just how creative Vikings got when regular food sources disappeared under feet of snow. Fire was everything to the Vikings during winter. Without it, families would freeze to death in their beds within hours. The hearth wasn't just a source of warmth, it was the beating heart that kept an entire household alive through months of brutal cold. But here's what most people don't realize about Viking fires. They burned continuously for the entire winter season. We're talking about keeping flames alive for 6 straight months, sometimes longer. The fire never went out, ever. Because rekindling a fire in the dead of winter, when your flint might be frozen and your hands too numb to work properly, could mean the difference between survival and becoming an ice sculpture. This meant Vikings needed absolutely massive amounts of fuel. A single family required several tons of firewood just to make it through one winter. Several tons, that's roughly the weight of 2 modern cars, except it's all wood that had to be chopped, hauled and stacked by hand. No chainsaws, no trucks, no easy shortcuts. The wood gathering started way back in summer, which makes perfect sense when you think about it. Fresh wood burns terribly, it's full of moisture and creates more smoke than heat. Vikings needed their firewood bone dry, seasoned for months under whatever sun they could get. They'd spend entire summer days in the forests, selecting the right trees, cutting them down with iron axes, and splitting everything into manageable pieces. Oak was the gold standard for winter fuel, it burned long, hot and steady. Birch came in second, it caught fire easily, and gave off decent heat, plus it had that pleasant smell that didn't make everyone's eyes water. Pine and other soft woods, those were emergency backup, they burned fast and left you constantly feeding the fire like a hungry monster. Then there's the fascinating part about peat. Vikings discovered that compressed, partially decomposed plant matter from bogs burned beautifully once dried out. Peat was free for the taking in many areas, and families would spend summer days cutting blocks of it, stacking them to dry like muddy bricks. When winter came, peat provided long-burning, steady heat that stretched precious wood supplies. But wait, it gets more resourceful. Animal dung became premium fuel when wood ran low. Dried cow, sheep and horse manure burns surprisingly well, giving off substantial heat with minimal smoke. Viking children learned early that nothing got wasted, even animal waste had survival value when the snow piled higher than the windows. The art of fire management became a family skill passed down through generations. Someone always stayed awake to tend the flames, usually rotating shifts between adults. Banking the fire for overnight meant carefully arranging logs and covering them with ash, slowing the burn while maintaining enough heat to restart easily come morning. Women often became the fire experts in Viking households. They knew exactly how to arrange different types of wood for maximum efficiency. Small kindling to catch quickly, medium pieces to build heat, and large logs to maintain steady burning through long winter nights. Getting this balance wrong meant wasting precious fuel, or worse, losing the fire completely. The hearth placement in Viking homes wasn't random either. That central fire pit was positioned to heat the entire longhouse as evenly as possible. Smoke rose naturally toward the roof opening, but families had to carefully manage airflow to prevent dangerous carbon monoxide buildup. Too little ventilation killed people in their sleep. Too much ventilation sucked away all the heat. Here's something that might surprise you. Vikings recycled their ashes. Wood ash contains potash, useful for making soap, preserving food and even fertilizing summer gardens. Nothing went to waste in a survival economy where every resource counted toward making it through another brutal winter. The psychological aspect of fire management was huge too. Families gathered around the hearth not just for warmth but for light, cooking, and social connection during those endless dark months. The fire represented life itself, hope burning bright against the killing cold outside. When fuel supplies ran dangerously low, families faced horrible choices: burn furniture, tear apart less essential parts of their homes. Some winters pushed people to desperate measures, sacrificing tomorrow's comfort for today's survival. The lucky ones had neighbors willing to share. The unlucky ones, well, not everyone made it to spring. Smart Viking families always gathered more fuel than they thought they'd need. Better to have leftover wood in spring than frozen corpses in February. This meant dedicating enormous amounts of summer labor to winter preparation, but that's how survival worked in a world where mistakes killed you. The fire that warmed their bodies also cooked their food, but that's another crucial piece of the winter survival puzzle we need to explore next. Because staying warm was only half the battle. Staying fed through months of frozen ground and empty hunting grounds required just as much planning and ingenuity. After months of burning through firewood to stay alive, Vikings knew their survival depended on something even more crucial than warmth. Food. You could pile on every fur in the world, but an empty stomach in February meant death was knocking at your door. The whole survival game started way back in late summer when every family member became obsessed with one thing: turning fresh food into something that wouldn't rot before spring. This wasn't your modern pantry stocking situation. We're talking about preserving enough calories to keep an entire family alive for 6 brutal months. Meat got the full treatment first. Vikings would slaughter animals in autumn and immediately start the preservation marathon. Salt was like gold to these people because it pulled every drop of moisture out of meat, making it impossible for bacteria to survive. They'd pack beef, pork, and mutton in thick layers of salt, then hang the chunks in cold, dry spaces where winter air could work its magic. But here's where it gets interesting. Smoking wasn't just about flavor, it was about creating a protective barrier. Vikings built special smokehouses where they'd burn specific types of wood for days. The smoke formed a coating on the meat that sealed out moisture and added chemicals that killed germs. Some families got so good at this they could make smoked meat last until the following winter. Then there was the fish situation. Living near water meant Vikings had access to cod, herring and other fish that became their protein lifeline. They perfected something called stockfish, basically cod that was cleaned, stretched on wooden racks and left to freeze dry in the harsh winter wind. This stuff became hard as rocks but would keep for years, literally years. When they needed food, they'd soak pieces in water and boom, protein that tasted almost fresh. Root vegetables presented their own challenge because these couldn't be salted or smoked like meat. Vikings dug storage pits called root cellars deep into the ground where temperatures stayed just above freezing. Turnips, carrots, onions and cabbages went into these underground vaults, carefully layered with straw and dirt. The earth itself became their refrigerator. Let's not forget the dairy situation. Summer was butter and cheese making season because cows produced the most milk when grass was abundant. Viking women would churn butter and pack it in wooden containers, then store these in the coldest parts of their homes. Hard cheeses were aged in caves or buried in snow, where they developed thick rinds that protected the inside from spoiling. Grains required different tactics altogether. Barley, oats, and wheat had to stay completely dry, or they'd turn into moldy mush within weeks. Vikings built elevated granaries, small wooden buildings on stilts that kept rodents out and air flowing around the grain. Every kernel was precious, because grinding grain into flour meant fresh bread, which was often the difference between a decent meal and pure survival rations. And the weird part is how they handled berries and fruits. Wild blueberries, lingonberries, and cloudberries were mixed with honey and packed into sealed containers. The natural sugars and honey created an environment where harmful bacteria couldn't survive, basically creating medieval jam that lasted months. Some families got creative with fermentation. They'd pack vegetables like cabbage in wooden barrels with salt water, creating an acidic environment that preserved the food while adding beneficial bacteria. This fermented cabbage gave them vitamin C during winter months, when fresh vegetables were impossible to find. But storage wasn't just about preservation methods. Location mattered enormously. Every Viking family had multiple hiding spots for their food supplies. Some was kept in the main house where they could guard it, but smart families scattered reserves in different locations. Root cellars, underground pits, elevated granaries, and even sealed containers buried in specific spots that only family members knew about. The pressure was intense because there were no second chances. A family that miscalculated how much food they needed, or lost supplies to spoilage, faced real starvation before spring arrived. Children learned early to never waste a single scrap of food because that piece of dried fish or chunk of preserved meat might be what kept them alive in March, when supplies ran lowest. Women especially became masters of portion control, calculating exactly how much food the family could eat each week, while still having enough for the full winter. They'd ration everything from grain to preserved vegetables, making sure the most nutritious foods were saved for the coldest, most dangerous months, when the body needed maximum energy to stay warm. This elaborate food storage system meant Viking families spent nearly half their year preparing for winter survival. But even with all this careful preservation, there was still the daily challenge of turning these stored ingredients into meals that would actually keep people alive and warm. The real test came when winter arrived, and families had to make these preserved foods stretch until spring finally returned. When the snow piled up outside, and the cold winds howled, Viking families gathered around their hearths for meals that were nothing like what we eat today. Their winter diet wasn't about variety or fancy flavors. It was pure survival fuel designed to keep bodies warm and energy levels up during the brutal Scandinavian months. The centerpiece of almost every winter meal was a thick, hearty stew bubbling away in an iron cauldron suspended over the fire. These weren't delicate soups you'd sip politely. They were dense, filling concoctions that could stick to your ribs for hours. Vikings tossed whatever preserved meat they had into the pot, chunks of salted pork, dried beef or smoked mutton, along with barley, beans and any root vegetables still good from their cellars. Carrots, turnips and onions added bulk and nutrients. The longer everything simmered together, the better it tasted, and the more it stretched to feed everyone. Porridge became another winter staple, but forget the sweet oatmeal we know today. Viking porridge was made from whatever grains they'd managed to store, barley, oats or rye, cooked with water or milk if they were lucky enough to have it. Sometimes they'd stir in a bit of honey or dried berries to make it more palatable, but most of the time it was pretty bland stuff. Still, it filled empty stomachs and provided the calories needed to generate body heat during those long freezing nights. Fresh bread was actually a luxury most Viking families couldn't afford during winter. Grinding grain into flour took precious energy, and they needed to save their stored grains to last until spring. When they did make bread, it was dense and heavy, more like a thick cracker than the fluffy loaves we're used to. Many families only baked bread for special occasions or when they had guests to impress. Then there's the preserved fish situation, which gets pretty interesting. Vikings had mastered the art of turning fresh catches into winter protein through various preservation methods. Air-dried cod, known as stockfish, became so hard you could practically use it as a hammer. Before eating, they had to soak these fish planks in water for hours, then boil or stew them until they softened enough to chew. The result wasn't exactly gourmet dining, but it packed serious nutrition and kept families from starving when other food sources ran low. Fermented fish was another story entirely, and definitely an acquired taste. Vikings would bury fish in the ground or store it in wooden barrels until it developed a powerful, pungent flavor that could clear a room. This stuff was incredibly rich in nutrients and could last for months without spoiling. Modern Scandinavians still eat variations of fermented fish today, proving these ancient preservation techniques worked better than anyone expected. Dairy products played a crucial role in winter nutrition, but not the way you might think. Fresh milk was rare since cows gave less during cold months and needed their energy to stay warm. Instead, Viking families relied on cheese and butter they'd made during the productive summer months. These were stored in cool cellars or sometimes buried in snow to keep them from spoiling. A chunk of aged cheese could add flavor and fat to otherwise boring meals, making the difference between surviving and thriving through winter. Vegetables weren't completely absent from Viking winter tables, but they required serious planning. Cabbages stored well and could be fermented into something resembling modern sauerkraut. Root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and parsnips stayed good in underground storage pits lined with straw. Dried beans and peas stored since harvest time added protein and bulk to stews. Every vegetable had to earn its place in the limited storage space. What's really fascinating is how Vikings used every single part of their animals for winter nutrition. Nothing went to waste when survival was on the line. Bone marrow was extracted and added to stews for extra fat and flavor. Blood was collected during slaughter and made into sausages or blood pudding. Dense, iron-rich foods perfect for cold weather. Even organ meats, which many people avoid today, became winter delicacies packed with vitamins that helped prevent disease during the dark months. The way Vikings approached winter eating shows just how different their priorities were from ours. They weren't thinking about balanced meals or dietary variety. They needed dense calories, warming foods, and nutrients that would keep their bodies functioning in extreme cold. Every meal had to serve the purpose of generating internal heat and maintaining energy levels for the physical demands of winter survival. But here's what's remarkable about their approach. Despite the limitations and harsh conditions, Viking families rarely suffered from malnutrition during winter months. Their preserved foods, while not exactly appetizing by modern standards, contained everything needed to stay healthy until spring arrived. This careful balance of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates kept entire communities alive through winters that would challenge even today's survival experts. Of course, all this winter eating was only possible because of the animals that made it through the cold months alongside their human families. When humans talk about surviving winter, we usually think about cranking up the thermostat or grabbing an extra blanket. Vikings, they had bigger problems. Their survival depended on keeping dozens of animals alive through months of brutal cold. Here's the thing most people don't realize. Losing your livestock in winter wasn't just sad, it was a death sentence for next year. No cows meant no milk, no cheese, no calves for spring. No sheep meant no wool for next winter's clothes. No goats meant watching your family freeze while neighbors stayed warm. Vikings weren't stupid about this. They planned their entire farm layout around winter animal care. Barns got built right next to the main house, sometimes sharing a wall. Why drag yourself through knee-deep snow twice a day to milk cows? Smart farmers could literally roll out of bed and check on their animals without stepping outside. But here's where it gets interesting. Those barns weren't just shelters, they were heating systems. A dozen cows packed together in a small space generate serious heat. Body temperature of a cow runs around 38 degrees Celsius, and they're basically walking furnaces that never turn off. Vikings discovered they could tap into this free heating by connecting their barns to their homes. The setup was brilliant, really. Warm air from the barn drifted through shared walls into the living space. Cold air from the house moved into the barn, got warmed by animal bodies, and cycled back. It's the world's first central heating system, powered by cow breath and sheep farts. Getting animals ready for winter lockdown started in late autumn. Every scrap of hay had to be cut, dried, and stored perfectly. Moldy hay kills animals faster than cold does. One bad batch meant watching your winter insurance policy die slowly in front of you. Then there's the math problem that kept Viking farmers awake at night. How much hay does a cow need for 6 months? Get it wrong, and you're making terrible choices by February. Feed the animals and risk your family starving, or let the livestock die and guarantee next winter kills everyone. Most families calculated about 2 tons of hay per cow for winter. Sheep needed less, but they also provided less milk and smaller offspring. Goats fell somewhere in between, though they had one advantage. They could survive on scraps and food waste that other animals couldn't digest. Water presented another headache entirely. Animals need gallons every day, but streams freeze solid for months. Vikings had to break ice twice daily, sometimes chopping through layers thick as a man's arm. Miss a day, and dehydrated animals start dying. Some clever farmers dug wells inside their barns. Crazy amount of work, but it meant never losing animals to thirst. Others melted snow constantly, feeding warm water to their livestock. Either way, someone had to tend animals twice a day, every day, no matter how brutal the weather outside. The smell though? Let's just say Viking barns in winter weren't places you wanted to linger. Dozens of animals packed together for months, with limited ventilation, and no way to properly clean stalls until spring. The ammonia from urine could burn your eyes and throat. Fresh air was a luxury nobody could afford when keeping animals alive mattered more than comfort. Pregnant animals created extra drama. Calves and lambs born in winter needed immediate warmth, or they'd freeze within hours. Some farmers brought newborns into their homes, creating interesting living arrangements where baby goats shared hearth space with human babies. But here's what really shows Viking priorities. Families often went hungry to keep animals fed. Sounds backwards until you realize that one surviving cow could provide milk for years, while eating that cow gives you meat for maybe a month. The math favored long-term thinking, even when kids went to bed with empty stomachs. Disease was the nightmare scenario every farmer feared. One sick animal in a packed barn could kill the entire herd within weeks. Vikings became experts at spotting early symptoms, changes in breathing, eating habits, or behavior that signaled trouble. Sick animals got isolated immediately, sometimes moved into the main house for closer monitoring. The hardest part wasn't the daily chores or even the smell. It was the constant worry. Every morning brought the same fear. Would you find dead animals when you opened the barn door? Every strange sound at night made farmers wonder if predators had found a way inside. Winter storms tested everything. Roofs had to support tons of snow while keeping out wind and moisture. Walls needed gaps for air circulation, but couldn't let in drafts that would freeze the animals. One structural failure meant losing months of preparation and planning. When spring finally arrived, surviving animals were skinny, weak, and probably half crazy from months of confinement, but they were alive. And that meant the family had won another round against the Scandinavian winter. Speaking of survival strategies, keeping animals alive was just one piece of the puzzle. Even with healthy livestock secure in heated barns, Viking families couldn't just wait for spring. While everyone else was huddled by the fire waiting for spring, Viking hunters strapped on their gear and headed into the frozen wilderness. Winter hunting wasn't optional. It was survival insurance wrapped in danger and opportunity. The snow actually made hunting easier in some ways. Animal tracks told stories clearer than any book. A set of deer prints heading toward water meant dinner might be just a few hundred yards away. Rabbit tracks crisscrossing through the woods revealed the best spots to set snares. Even predator signs helped hunters understand which areas to avoid and which animals were feeling desperate enough to take risks. But here's where Viking ingenuity really shone. They didn't just stumble around in snowdrifts hoping to bump into a meal. These guys had techniques that would impress modern hunters. They knew that hungry animals moved during the brief daylight hours, making themselves visible against the white landscape. Deer, elk, and even wild boar left clear trails between their feeding spots and shelter. All Vikings used persistence hunting in winter conditions that would send most people running back indoors. Picture tracking an injured elk for hours through knee-deep snow, following blood drops and broken branches. The animal might be stronger, but Vikings had endurance and patience that bordered on supernatural. They could outlast almost anything on 4 legs. Trapping became an art form during the frozen months. Simple wooden snares caught rabbits and birds, but Vikings also built elaborate deadfall traps using heavy stones balanced on sticks. These contraptions could take down larger animals without requiring the hunter to be present. Smart placement near water sources or game trails meant waking up to fresh meat without burning calories trudging through snow. Then there's the equipment that made winter hunting possible. Early skis weren't just for getting around. They were hunting tools that gave Vikings stealth advantages. Gliding silently over snow meant getting close enough for spear throws or bow shots. The swishing sound of wooden skis was quieter than footsteps crunching through frozen ground. Snowshoes served a different purpose entirely. While skis worked great on packed snow and gentle slopes, snowshoes handled the deep, soft powder that accumulated in forests and valleys. Vikings could walk on top of snow that would swallow them up to their waist otherwise. This meant accessing hunting grounds that animals thought were safe from human predators. Winter hunting required different weapons too. Bowstrings made from animal sinew could snap in extreme cold, so hunters carried backup strings kept warm against their bodies. Spear points needed regular sharpening since frozen animal hide was tougher than summer leather. Some hunters even used weighted throwing sticks for stunning birds and small game. The psychological game mattered just as much as physical preparation. Animals in winter were desperate, which made them both easier to predict and more dangerous to approach. A cornered elk or wild boar could kill a hunter faster than frostbite. Vikings learned to read animal behavior in winter conditions, understanding when hunger made creatures bold and when cold made them sluggish. Let's not forget that winter hunting provided more than just extra calories. Fresh meat contained vitamins that stored food couldn't provide after months of preservation. The iron and nutrients in fresh blood helped prevent diseases that plagued people living on dried fish and old vegetables. Hunters literally brought health home along with protein. Animal hides taken in winter were premium quality too. Cold weather meant thicker fur coats and denser pelts perfect for making warm clothing. A successful winter hunt could provide material for new boots, mittens, or blankets that would serve the family for years. Every scrap of hide, bone, and sinew had value during resource-scarce months. But the risks were absolutely real. Getting lost in a blizzard while tracking game meant almost certain death. Falling through ice while pursuing animals near frozen streams was another deadly possibility. Hunters carried fire-starting materials and emergency food, but winter conditions could overwhelm even experienced outdoorsmen within hours. Some Viking hunters worked in pairs or small groups, sharing the risks and increasing success chances. Others preferred solo hunting, moving faster and making less noise. Both approaches required incredible skill reading weather patterns and understanding how quickly winter conditions could turn lethal. The weirdest part about Viking winter hunting was how it connected families to the natural world during isolation months. While everyone else stayed indoors, hunters brought back stories along with meat. They reported which streams still flowed, where other families had traveled, and what wildlife was surviving the harsh season. Women and children often helped process hunting results, turning fresh kills into preserved food that extended winter stores. Nothing got wasted. Organs became immediate meals while muscle meat was dried or smoked for later consumption. Winter hunting shaped Viking culture in ways that lasted generations. The skills, patience, and courage required created legendary stories passed down through families. These tales didn't just entertain during long dark evenings, they taught essential survival knowledge to future hunters. While hunting provided crucial winter resources, Vikings had another transportation innovation that revolutionized cold weather survival. Their mastery of skiing went far beyond simple hunting assistance, transforming how entire communities moved and thrived during frozen months. Forget everything you think you know about skiing being just a weekend hobby for rich people hitting the slopes. For Vikings, skis weren't recreational equipment, they were survival tools that meant the difference between life and death during those brutal Scandinavian winters. The Vikings didn't invent skiing, but they sure perfected it. Archaeological evidence shows they were gliding across snow on wooden planks over 1,000 years ago. These weren't your modern high-tech skis either. Viking skis were long, narrow pieces of wood, sometimes stretching nearly 3 meters in length. They carved them from single pieces of pine or birch, then spent hours smoothing and shaping each pair by hand. Here's where it gets interesting. Viking children often learned to ski before they could walk properly. Parents would strap tiny skis onto toddlers' feet and let them slide around the house. By age 5, most Viking kids could navigate snowy terrain better than adults from warmer climates could walk on flat ground. This early training wasn't just cute family fun, it was essential preparation for survival. But why were skis so crucial? Well, imagine trying to walk through snow that's waist deep. Every step becomes a massive effort. You sink down, struggle to pull your leg out, take another step, and sink again. After just a few minutes, you're exhausted and sweating, which in freezing temperatures could actually kill you. Skis changed everything. They distributed body weight across a much larger surface area, letting Vikings glide over snow that would otherwise trap them. The practical applications were endless. Hunters used skis to track animals through deep forests where walking would be impossible. They could move silently across the snow, following deer or elk tracks for miles without making noise. Some Viking hunters became so skilled they could ski downhill while shooting arrows. Talk about multitasking under pressure. Then there's the social aspect that most people overlook. Viking communities were often separated by vast distances, especially during winter when roads became impassable. Skis kept families and neighbors connected. A Viking could ski 20 kilometers to visit relatives, deliver news or trade goods. Journeys that would take days on foot suddenly became afternoon trips. Viking skis had another clever feature. They weren't always matched pairs. Often one ski would be longer than the other. The longer ski was for gliding, while the shorter one provided better control and was sometimes covered with fur on the bottom for gripping uphill terrain. This asymmetrical design worked brilliantly for their specific needs, even though it would look completely wrong to modern skiers. The bindings were simple but effective, usually just leather straps that held the foot in place while allowing the heel to lift. Vikings wore their regular winter boots while skiing, not specialized footwear. This meant they could transition quickly from skiing to walking without changing equipment. Here's something that might surprise you. Vikings used ski poles, but not like modern ones. They typically used a single long pole, almost like a staff, which served multiple purposes. It helped with balance and steering while skiing, but could also be used as a walking stick, a probe for testing snow depth, or even a weapon if necessary. The Norse took skiing so seriously that it appeared in their mythology and religious beliefs. Ultra, the god of skiing and hunting, was depicted gliding across snow on wooden skis. Skadi, a goddess associated with winter and the mountains, was also linked with skiing. These weren't just stories, they reflected how deeply embedded skiing was in Viking culture and identity. Winter warfare relied heavily on ski troops. Viking warriors could move quickly across snow-covered battlefields, appearing seemingly from nowhere to attack enemies who were struggling through deep snow on foot. Some historical accounts describe Viking ski soldiers as appearing like ghosts, materializing from snowy forests to strike and then disappearing again. The maintenance of skis was an ongoing winter task. All Vikings regularly applied pine tar or animal fat to the bottoms to improve gliding and prevent the wood from drying out and cracking. They carved grooves along the length of the ski to help with tracking straight lines, a technique still used on modern cross-country skis. What's really remarkable is how Vikings adapted their skiing technique to different snow conditions. Powder snow required different movements than packed snow or icy surfaces. They developed techniques for skiing uphill, downhill, and across varying terrain, skills that took years to master but were essential for winter survival. The endurance required for Viking-style skiing was incredible. Historical accounts describe messengers skiing for days across hundreds of kilometers, stopping only briefly to rest and eat. These weren't casual outings, they were grueling journeys that demanded exceptional physical conditioning and mental toughness. But even the most skilled skiers faced limitations when snow conditions became truly treacherous. Deep, soft powder could still slow them down, and ice storms made skiing dangerous even for experts. When skis weren't enough, Vikings had another ingenious solution for winter travel, and that backup plan proved just as essential for surviving those endless frozen months. Deep snow wasn't just an inconvenience for Vikings, it was a potential death trap. One wrong step could send you plunging waist deep into a drift, exhausting yourself trying to climb out while precious body heat leaked away. That's where snowshoes came in, turning treacherous winter terrain into something manageable. These weren't the modern aluminum contraptions you see at sporting goods stores today. Viking snowshoes were handcrafted, works of survival engineering, built from whatever materials the harsh northern landscape provided. The frame started with flexible wood. Birch was preferred when available. Ash worked too. The wood needed to bend without snapping, crucial for the oval or teardrop shape that distributed a person's weight across the snow's surface. Here's where it gets interesting. The webbing that filled the frame came from animal sinew, carefully stripped from deer, elk, or reindeer. This wasn't just any old string. Sinew had natural elasticity and incredible strength when properly prepared. Vikings would soak it, stretch it, then weave it in tight patterns across the wooden frame. The result, a natural suspension system that flexed with each step while keeping the wearer afloat on powder that would otherwise swallow them whole. Making snowshoes wasn't a quick weekend project. The process started months earlier during hunting season when animals were killed for meat. Smart Vikings saved every scrap of sinew, knowing they'd need it when the snow started falling. Women typically handled the intricate weaving work, their nimble fingers creating patterns that balanced durability with flexibility. Too tight, and the webbing would snap in extreme cold. Too loose, and feet would punch through, defeating the entire purpose. The attachment system was equally clever. Leather straps wrapped around boots, holding feet securely while allowing the heel to lift naturally during walking. This pivot point was critical. It let Vikings maintain a relatively normal gait instead of the awkward shuffle you might expect. Some designs included a small platform or bar where the foot rested, giving extra support during long journeys. Size mattered enormously. Larger snowshoes spread weight over more surface area, perfect for deep powder but clumsy in tight spaces. Smaller ones offered maneuverability, but could sink in really deep snow. Most Vikings owned multiple pairs for different conditions, switching based on snow depth and where they needed to travel. But here's what made Viking snowshoes use truly impressive. They weren't just walking around the homestead. These people were covering serious distances in brutal conditions. A hunting party might travel 10 or 15 miles through forests and across frozen lakes, pursuing game that meant the difference between a fed family and a starving one. Traders used snowshoes to reach distant settlements, carrying valuable goods on their backs while navigating terrain that would stop a horse cold. The learning curve was steeper than you might think. Kids started young, practicing on small snowshoes around the farm before graduating to longer journeys. Balance took time to master. The wide stance felt awkward at first, and beginners often caught one shoe on the other, taking spectacular tumbles into the snow. Veterans developed a distinctive rolling gait that looked almost effortless. Maintenance became a constant winter routine. Cold made leather brittle and could snap sinew if it wasn't properly cared for. Vikings checked their snowshoes daily, looking for fraying webbing or loose bindings. Quick repairs were essential. A broken snowshoe miles from home in a blizzard could turn into a life-threatening situation fast. Many carried spare sinew and basic tools for field repairs. The truly skilled could make emergency snowshoes from scratch using nothing but materials found in winter forests. Flexible branches became the frame. Strips of bark or even clothing could substitute for webbing. These makeshift versions wouldn't last long, but they might get someone home alive after their regular snowshoes broke. Weather affected performance dramatically. Wet, heavy snow stuck to the webbing, making each step feel like lifting weights. Extreme cold made everything brittle. Frames could crack, bindings could snap without warning. Veterans knew to check their gear extra carefully before heading out in the worst conditions. Some Vikings became legendary for their snowshoe skills. Stories tell of hunters who could track game for days across trackless wilderness, moving so quietly they could approach deer within spear range. Messengers covered incredible distances, carrying vital news between settlements when other forms of travel became impossible. The psychological benefit was huge too. Knowing you could move freely across winter terrain, instead of being trapped by snow, made the difference between feeling like a prisoner in your own land and maintaining some control over your environment. Independence meant survival, yet even with snowshoes, winter travel remained dangerous. The shoes worked best on certain types of snow. Powder and packed snow were ideal, but icy crusts could be treacherous. One moment you're gliding along the surface, the next you've broken through, and you're struggling in deep snow with unwieldy shoes strapped to your feet. As essential as snowshoes were for ground travel, Vikings had another challenge to solve: navigating through the endless winter darkness that engulfed their world for months at a time. When the sun disappeared for months at a time in Viking lands, darkness became their constant companion. We're talking about places where daylight lasted maybe 4 hours on a good day, and in the far north, the sun might not show its face for weeks. The Vikings didn't just shrug and accept this cosmic joke, they fought back with fire and ingenuity. Tallow candles were their primary weapon against the endless night. These weren't the fancy scented candles you'd find in a modern store. Viking candles were made from rendered sheep fat. And let's be honest, they probably smelled like a barnyard mixed with a campfire, but they worked. And that's what mattered when you're trying to mend a fishing net, or prepare tomorrow's meal in what feels like perpetual midnight. The process of making these candles was surprisingly sophisticated. Viking families would save every scrap of fat from butchered animals during the warmer months. Sheep fat was preferred because it burned cleanly and lasted longer than other animal fats. Women would heat the fat slowly, strain out any impurities, then dip twisted plant fibers or thin strips of cloth repeatedly into the hot tallow until a proper candle formed around the wick. Then there's the matter of beeswax candles, the luxury option of Viking lighting. These burned brighter, cleaner, and without the barnyard aroma of tallow. But beeswax was precious, almost like currency in some regions. Only the wealthiest families could afford to burn beeswax regularly through the dark months. Most saved these special candles for important occasions or emergencies when clear, bright light was absolutely essential. Oil lamps provided another solution to the darkness problem. Vikings crafted shallow stone or clay bowls, filled them with fish oil or seal oil, and floated wicks made from twisted moss or plant fibers. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the turf walls, creating an almost hypnotic atmosphere during those long winter evenings. Seal oil was particularly prized in coastal areas. It burned with a steady, bright flame and produced less smoke than other oils. But here's where Viking practicality really shines through. They understood light rationing long before anyone coined the term. Families couldn't afford to burn candles and lamps freely throughout the winter. Supplies had to last until spring returned, which might be 5 or 6 months away. This meant strategic lighting, one candle or lamp for the entire family during evening meals and essential tasks, then darkness for sleeping. Children learned to navigate their homes in complete darkness, feeling their way along familiar walls and furniture. Adults developed an almost supernatural ability to perform daily tasks by feel alone. Spinning wool, carving wood, even preparing simple foods, all accomplished in near total darkness to save precious light supplies. The social dynamics around light were fascinating too. When a family lit a candle, it became the focal point of the entire household. Everyone gathered around that single flame for warmth, conversation, and whatever work needed doing. Stories were told, riddles shared, and songs sung in these intimate circles of flickering light. The candle literally brought the family together each night. Viking homes were designed with lighting in mind. Reflective surfaces, polished metal pieces or light-colored stones were positioned to maximize the reach of whatever light source they had. Some families used clever arrangements of white birch bark on walls to help bounce candlelight around their living spaces more effectively. Emergency lighting protocols were serious business. Each household kept a small reserve of candles and lamp oil that was absolutely forbidden for regular use. These emergency supplies were for genuine crises, medical emergencies, unexpected travelers needing shelter, or situations where bright light could mean the difference between life and death. Maintaining these light sources became a specialized skill set. Wicks needed constant trimming to prevent smoking and ensure even burning. Oil lamps required regular cleaning to prevent buildup that could affect flame quality. Candles had to be stored properly to prevent cracking in the extreme cold, which would make them burn unevenly or go out unexpectedly. The psychological impact of having even small amounts of artificial light can't be overstated. These tiny flames provided more than just illumination. They offered hope, comfort, and a sense of human control over the hostile winter environment. When everything outside was frozen, dark, and potentially deadly, that small circle of warm light represented safety and civilization. Some families developed rotation systems for light maintenance duties. Children learned to tend wicks and refill oil lamps as part of their winter education. Older family members often took responsibility for the precious candle and oil reserves, ensuring nothing was wasted through carelessness or inexperience. As winter nights stretched endlessly onward, these small flames became lifelines connecting Viking families to productivity, togetherness, and sanity. But staying busy during those dark months required more than just light. It demanded countless hours of essential indoor work that kept both hands and minds occupied through the coldest season. When the brutal Scandinavian winter locked families inside their longhouses for months, Vikings didn't just sit around waiting for spring. Those endless dark hours became their most productive time of year. The flickering firelight that barely pushed back the shadows also illuminated busy hands working on essential repairs, crafting new tools, and creating the items that would keep them alive. Men gathered around the central hearth with their broken weapons, damaged farm tools, and worn sleds. Winter was weapon maintenance season. A dull axe blade could mean the difference between splitting firewood efficiently or exhausting yourself trying. They carefully sharpened every edge, rewrapped leather grips that had loosened during autumn work, and reinforced wooden handles that showed stress cracks. The rhythmic scraping of whetstones against metal became one of winter's most common sounds. But here's what most people don't realize about Viking men during winter. They weren't just maintaining tools, they were improving them. A plow that hadn't worked quite right the previous season got completely redesigned. Salad runners were examined for wear patterns and reinforced with strips of iron, if the family was wealthy enough to afford it. Every tool failure from the past year became a winter project to solve. Then there were the women, whose winter work was absolutely backbreaking. While modern people might think spinning and weaving sounds peaceful, Viking women were basically running textile factories from their homes. They had to produce enough clothing to keep entire families warm for months. Raw wool had to be cleaned, combed, spun into thread, dyed with carefully saved plant materials, and then woven into fabric on large looms. The spinning never stopped. Women would spin thread while tending children, while cooking, even while telling stories in the evening. Their fingers moved automatically, creating the literal lifeline that kept their families from freezing. A single woolen cloak required weeks of work, and each family member needed multiple layers of clothing to survive. Repairs were just as crucial as new creation. Every torn seam, every worn spot, every loose thread got attention during winter months. Vikings couldn't just throw away damaged clothing and buy new items. That ripped tunic had to be mended perfectly, or someone might freeze. Women developed incredible skills at invisible repairs, reinforcing weak spots before they became holes, and even completely reconstructing garments from salvageable pieces of several worn-out items. Children weren't left out of this indoor industry either. Young Vikings learned essential survival skills during these dark months. Boys as young as 8 learned to carve wood, repair simple tools, and understand how different materials work together. They made their own toys, wooden swords, carved animals, simple games, but these weren't just for fun. Every carved toy taught knife skills that would become essential for survival. Girls learned the textile arts early, starting with simple spinning and gradually working up to complex weaving patterns. By age 12, most Viking girls could produce thread nearly as fine as their mothers. They also learned the crucial skill of recognizing wool quality, understanding which sheep produced the best fiber for different purposes. The whole family participated in leather work during winter evenings. Hides from autumn hunting had to be properly treated, cut, and sewn into boots, mittens, and repair patches for existing leather goods. This work required incredible precision. Poorly sewn boots that leaked or didn't fit properly could cause frostbite or death during winter travel. Wood carving became both necessity and art during these months. Broken bowls, spoons, and cups needed replacement. Damaged furniture required repair or complete reconstruction, but Vikings also carved decorative items, intricate patterns on tool handles, beautiful designs on household items, even complex storytelling scenes on larger pieces. What's fascinating is how these indoor months became innovation time. Vikings developed new techniques, experimented with different materials, and solved problems that had frustrated them during busier seasons. A woman might figure out a better way to waterproof leather. A man might design a more efficient trap for catching winter game. Children might invent new games that actually taught useful skills. The constant work also served another crucial purpose. It kept families warm through activity. Sitting motionless in cold houses was dangerous. The physical movement required for crafting, combined with the body heat generated by multiple people working close together, added precious warmth to their living spaces. Winter craftwork created the foundation for the entire next year's survival. Every repaired tool, every new piece of clothing, every improved household item increased the family's chances of making it through future challenges. These weren't just busy work projects to pass time, they were literal lifelines being woven, carved, and forged by firelight. But all this indoor productivity couldn't solve one major challenge that threatened Viking mental health during the endless winter darkness. The human spirit needed more than just busy hands to survive months of isolation. And Vikings had developed some surprisingly sophisticated ways to keep their minds sharp and their families united when the darkness seemed endless. When you're stuck inside for months with the same people, eating the same food, staring at the same walls, something dangerous starts creeping in. It wasn't the cold that broke Viking families during those brutal winters, it was the crushing weight of boredom. The human mind wasn't built to handle 20 hours of darkness every day for half a year. Without something to occupy their thoughts, Vikings could slip into despair faster than frostbite could claim their fingers. Smart families knew this threat, and fought it with everything they had. Storytelling became their greatest weapon against the mental darkness. But these weren't bedtime stories for children. Viking tales were epic sagas that could stretch across entire weeks, filled with gods battling monsters, heroes conquering impossible odds, and ancestors whose deeds shaped the world. The best storytellers held audiences captive for hours, their voices rising and falling with the drama while shadows danced on the walls. Every family member had stories to tell. Grandparents shared memories from their youth, when winters were supposedly even harsher and wolves roamed closer to the settlements. Parents recounted local legends about hidden treasures buried beneath the snow, or spirits that wandered the frozen forests. Even children contributed, making up adventures about their favorite farm animals or imagining what lay beyond the mountains. Then there were the riddles. Vikings loved testing each other's wits with clever wordplay and puzzles that twisted the mind in knots. What has roots nobody sees, is taller than trees, up it goes, and yet never grows? The answer: a mountain. These brain teasers could spark debates lasting entire evenings, with family members arguing over interpretations and creating new riddles on the spot. Music filled the spaces between stories. Simple wooden flutes, drums made from animal hide, and singing voices created melodies that lifted spirits above the howling wind outside. Songs told of summer days, successful raids, and loves left behind in distant lands. Some tunes were so catchy that even the grumpiest uncle would find himself humming along. But Vikings were practical people. They couldn't just sit around entertaining each other all winter. Their hands needed work, and that work became another form of mental salvation. Men carved intricate patterns into bone handles for knives, turning simple tools into works of art. They whittled chess pieces, toy boats for their children, and decorative bowls that would last generations. Women turned thread into tapestries that told visual stories, their needles creating scenes of battles, harvests, and mythical creatures. The repetitive motions of spinning and weaving became almost meditative, allowing minds to wander while hands stayed busy. Young girls learned by watching, their small fingers gradually mastering the techniques that would serve them throughout their lives. The weird part is how competitive they got about these crafts. Families would compare their winter creations like modern people, show off vacation photos. The farmer who carved the most detailed chess set gained respect. The woman who wove the finest patterns earned admiration from neighbors. These projects gave everyone something to work toward during those endless dark months. Games turned winter evenings into battlegrounds of strategy and luck. A board game called Hunamor Fatafad challenged players to outmaneuver opponents in mock warfare, teaching tactical thinking that might prove useful in real battles come spring. Dice games created excitement and gambling opportunities, even when the stakes were nothing more than extra portions of stew or first choice of sleeping spots near the fire. Wrestling matches erupted regularly between brothers, cousins, and friends. These weren't gentle competitions but serious tests of strength that could leave participants bruised and breathless. The physical activity helped release tension that built up from being cooped up together, and victories provided bragging rights that lasted until someone else proved stronger. Let's not forget the importance of planning and dreaming together. Families spent countless hours discussing what they'd do when spring returned. Which fields needed expanding? Should they trade with the neighbors to the south, or try reaching the distant market town? These conversations kept hope alive and gave everyone something to anticipate beyond mere survival. Children received informal education during these long nights. Adults taught them practical skills like reading runes, identifying different types of wood, and understanding weather patterns. Boys learned about weapons maintenance and basic blacksmithing. Girls mastered cooking techniques and herb identification. Knowledge passed down through generations, ensuring survival skills never disappeared. The smartest Vikings understood something crucial about human nature. People needed purpose beyond just staying alive. Crafts provided accomplishment. Stories fed imagination. Games created excitement. Music stirred emotions. Planning gave direction. Remove these elements, and even the toughest warriors could crumble under winter's psychological assault. Maintaining morale wasn't just about individual families staying sane. Entire communities depended on everyone keeping their spirits up because desperate people made dangerous decisions that could threaten everyone's survival. When the temperature drops to bone-chilling levels and survival becomes a daily battle, something remarkable happens to human nature. Vikings didn't just endure their brutal winters alone. They created networks of mutual support that could mean the difference between life and death. The harsh reality was simple. A family isolated during a severe blizzard might not make it through, but a community that looked out for each other, their chances jumped dramatically. Viking settlements developed an unspoken code during winter months. Everyone understood that helping your neighbor today meant they'd help you tomorrow. Picture Eric's family running dangerously low on firewood after an unexpected early storm. In our modern world, he might just order more online. Vikings had a different solution. Neighbors would share from their own carefully hoarded supplies, knowing full well that Eric would remember this kindness when spring trading began. Well, this wasn't just charity, it was smart survival strategy. Communities that fractured during winter often found themselves with empty houses come spring. Dead neighbors couldn't help with planting, trading, or defending against raiders. The checking system Vikings developed was surprisingly organized. Older children were assigned routes to visit nearby homes every few days during severe weather. They'd knock, check on the elderly, and report back if anyone needed help. Think of it as an early warning system powered by teenage legs and community responsibility. But winter also brought people together in ways that might surprise us. When you're trapped indoors for months, petty disputes start looking pretty foolish. That argument about property boundaries from last summer suddenly seemed less important when your neighbor's skill at repairing broken roof beams could save your family from freezing. Villages organized what we might call winter work parties today. Groups of men would travel from house to house, helping repair storm damage or reinforcing structures against the next blizzard. Women formed similar networks, sharing spinning wheels, looms, and expertise in preserving food that was starting to spoil. The weird part is how winter festivals became survival tools disguised as celebrations. These gatherings weren't just about having fun, they were strategic community meetings. Families would assess who had surplus supplies and who was running short. Informal agreements got made over shared meals and storytelling sessions. Children played a crucial role in this community network too. Kids would be sent to deliver small gifts between families, a jar of preserved berries here, some fresh-baked flatbread there. These exchanges weren't random acts of kindness. They were carefully calculated ways to strengthen social bonds that everyone would need to survive. Then there's the fascinating phenomenon of winter guests. Traveling merchants, craftsmen, or even distant relatives might show up at a Viking settlement just as the worst weather hit. Rather than turning them away, communities would absorb these extra mouths to feed. Why? Because these outsiders brought news, skills, and fresh perspectives that made the long dark months more bearable. Viking communities also developed rotation systems for the most dangerous winter tasks. Breaking ice on frozen wells, hunting in blizzard conditions, or venturing out to check on livestock during storms. These jobs were shared among the strongest community members. Nobody was expected to risk their life alone when others could help. Let's not forget how disputes were handled during winter months. Communities couldn't afford to have feuding families disrupting the delicate balance of survival. Village elders would step in quickly to mediate conflicts, often forcing opposing parties to work together on essential tasks until their anger cooled. The sharing of specialized knowledge became another survival strategy. The best hunter would teach tracking techniques during long evenings by the fire. The most skilled healer would pass along herbal remedies to multiple families. The finest craftsman would show others how to repair essential tools without wasting precious materials. Makes sense, right? When spring finally arrived, these winter bonds had transformed entire settlements. Families who had shared resources, labor, and risks together emerged as stronger, more unified communities. But here's what's really interesting about Viking winter cooperation. It created social debts that lasted all year. The family that shared their last stored apples in February could count on help building a new barn in June. These weren't formal contracts written on parchment. They were promises sealed by shared hardship and mutual dependence. Communities that mastered this cooperative spirit became known throughout the region. Other settlements would send their young people to learn not just craft skills, but the social techniques that made survival more certain. The bonds forged during these harsh months shaped Viking society in ways that extended far beyond winter survival. The same cooperation that kept families alive through blizzards would later organize successful raids, establish trade routes, and build the social structures that made Viking expansion possible. However, all this community cooperation meant nothing if people started getting seriously sick or injured during the worst weather. When illness struck a Viking household in the middle of winter, the real test of survival skills began. Winter in Viking lands wasn't just about battling cold and darkness. Disease lurked in every shadow, waiting to strike when bodies were already weakened by months of harsh conditions. A simple cut could turn deadly. A fever could wipe out an entire family before spring returned. Cold weather brought its own special brand of medical nightmares. Frostbite crept up on people who spent too much time outside gathering wood or checking on animals. Toes and fingers turned white, then black. The unlucky ones lost digits entirely. Vikings learned to recognize the early warning signs: tingling skin that felt like pins and needles. They'd massage affected areas by the fire, sometimes saving limbs that would otherwise be lost forever. But frostbite was just the beginning. Respiratory illnesses spread like wildfire in cramped longhouses where entire families huddled together for warmth. One person's cough became everyone's problem within days. Children were especially vulnerable, their small bodies struggling to fight off infections while staying warm enough to survive. Viking healers, usually older women with decades of experience, became the difference between life and death. These weren't doctors in any modern sense. They were part herbalist, part surgeon, part spiritual guide. During summer months, they'd carefully gather and dry medicinal plants, storing them in leather pouches and wooden containers for winter emergencies. Willow bark served as their aspirin, reducing fever and easing pain. Honey wasn't just food, it was liquid medicine. Vikings discovered that honey could prevent wounds from getting infected, though they didn't understand why. Modern science knows honey has natural antibacterial properties, but Vikings just knew it worked. Garlic fought off respiratory infections. These healers guarded their knowledge carefully, passing recipes and techniques down through generations. Setting broken bones required serious skill and nerve. Vikings couldn't exactly call for help when someone fell through ice or got trampled by livestock. Healers fashioned wooden splints from whatever materials they could find, binding fractures with strips of leather or cloth. The patient usually bit down on a piece of wood while the bone was set. No anesthesia existed, except maybe some fermented drink to dull the pain. Then there's the psychological toll that winter took on Viking communities. We might call it seasonal depression today, but Vikings just knew that some people became sad and listless during the darkest months. Healers treated this with social remedies, encouraging storytelling, music, and community gatherings. They understood instinctively that isolation made everything worse. Childbirth during winter presented terrifying challenges. Pregnant women couldn't exactly choose their due dates, and babies arrived regardless of blizzards or sub-zero temperatures. Midwives worked by flickering candlelight, using heated stones to keep newborns warm. Many infants didn't survive their first winter, and mothers faced serious risks from complications that would be minor today. Food poisoning posed constant danger. Preserved meats sometimes went bad, despite careful preparation. Vikings learned to recognize signs of spoiled food, but mistakes happened. Families dealing with food poisoning while trapped indoors by storms faced life-threatening situations. Healers treated these cases with herbal teas and broths, hoping to flush toxins from the system. Viking healers also served as dentists, using crude tools to extract rotten teeth. Dental problems were common. All that dried and salted food was tough on teeth. A severe toothache could drive someone to desperation during long winter nights. Healers used heated metal tools to cauterize wounds after extractions, another agonizing procedure without modern pain relief. Emergency surgery sometimes became necessary. Vikings who injured themselves with axes or farming tools needed immediate attention. Healers stitched wounds using sinew from animals, creating surprisingly effective sutures. They cleaned wounds with boiled water or alcohol when available, somehow understanding that cleanliness prevented complications. Knowledge was power in Viking medical practice. Healers maintained mental libraries of symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. They learned from every patient, building expertise that could save lives years later. These healers enjoyed special status in their communities. Everyone knew they might need their services before winter ended. The psychological pressure on these healers must have been enormous. Entire families depended on their knowledge and judgment. Success meant survival. Failure often meant death. They carried this responsibility through every dark winter month, making life and death decisions with limited tools and knowledge. Herbal remedies weren't always enough. Sometimes healers had to make difficult choices about who could be saved and who was beyond help. Resources were limited, and investing time and medicine in hopeless cases might doom others who had better chances of recovery. Vikings also believed in supernatural causes for illness, mixing practical medicine with spiritual practices. Healers might perform rituals alongside medical treatments, covering all possible bases. This combination of rational and mystical approaches reflected their understanding that healing involved more than just physical symptoms. But even the most skilled healers faced situations where medicine wasn't enough. When illness struck entire communities simultaneously, survival became a matter of luck as much as treatment. Those dark winter months tested every aspect of Viking resilience. Yet these same medical challenges shaped innovations that would serve Vikings for generations. Their wound care, bone setting, and herbal knowledge formed foundations that influenced medieval medicine across Europe. However, staying healthy also meant staying protected from the brutal winds that could kill just as surely as any disease. Wind was the silent killer that could turn a survivable winter into a death trap. While Vikings had mastered fire, food storage, and warm clothing, they quickly learned that none of these defenses meant much if howling winds could strip away heat faster than their bodies could produce it. The first lesson every Viking builder learned was simple: never face the worst winds head-on. Homes were deliberately positioned with their backs to the north, where the coldest and most vicious winds originated. This wasn't just a preference, it was survival strategy. A house facing north winds directly could lose so much heat that even a roaring fire couldn't keep the family warm. But positioning alone wasn't enough. Vikings constructed elaborate windbreaks around their settlements, creating barriers from whatever materials they could gather. Earth berms were piled high on the windward side of homes, sometimes reaching halfway up the walls. These weren't small garden barriers either. We're talking about massive earthworks that took entire communities weeks to build. Wooden windbreaks served double duty during winter months. Farmers would stack split logs and rough timber in strategic locations, creating walls that broke the wind's force before it reached their homes. The clever part: these same wood piles served as their winter fuel supply, positioned exactly where they needed protection most. Then there's the brilliant use of turf as wind armor. Vikings didn't just build with turf, they added extra layers when winter storms threatened. Families would literally pile additional chunks of earth and grass against their walls, creating a thicker barrier against penetrating winds. The house would almost disappear under these protective layers, looking more like a grass-covered hill than a dwelling. Fences became unexpected allies in the fight against wind. Rather than clearing snow away from their boundary fences, smart Viking families would actually pack more snow against them. This created natural insulation barriers that could block wind and trap warm air closer to their homes. Snow, ironically, became one of their best insulators when used correctly. Every tiny opening in a Viking home was treated like a potential disaster. Gaps around doors, small cracks in walls, even the spaces between roof timbers could let in enough cold air to make life miserable. Vikings stuffed these openings with whatever they had: wool scraps, dried grass, animal hair, even old rags. Nothing was too humble if it could stop wind from sneaking inside. The really smart families went a step further with their wind protection. They created double barriers around the most vulnerable parts of their homes. First, they'd build the main windbreak, then add a second, smaller barrier a few feet in front of it. This created a dead air space that made winds swirl and lose their cutting force before reaching the house. Windows, when they existed at all, were tiny for good reason. Large openings meant large opportunities for wind to steal precious heat, but Vikings couldn't live in complete darkness, so they developed techniques for covering these small windows during the worst storms. Thick animal hides, multiple layers of cloth, even wooden shutters, anything to seal out the wind while keeping some flexibility for light and air. Doors required special attention because families couldn't seal them permanently. Viking doors were built low and thick, designed to minimize the opening size and reduce heat loss every time someone entered or left. Many families hung heavy curtains or animal skins just inside the door, creating an airlock effect that trapped cold air before it could reach the main living space. The battle against wind wasn't just about the house itself. Vikings learned to read wind patterns and predict when the worst storms were coming. Families would spend days before major storms adding extra protection, reinforcing weak spots and gathering everything they needed inside so they wouldn't have to venture out during the worst weather. Some Viking settlements developed community wind protection systems. Neighbors would coordinate their windbreaks to create protected corridors between houses, allowing people to move around even during storms. These weren't individual efforts. Entire villages worked together to create wind-protected zones. Animal shelters received the same careful attention. Barn doors faced away from prevailing winds, and livestock areas were positioned to take advantage of natural landscape features that blocked wind. A well-placed hill or grove of trees could mean the difference between animals surviving or freezing. The psychological impact of constant wind was something Vikings understood instinctively. Howling winds could drive people toward madness during long winter months. Creating quiet spaces protected from wind wasn't just about physical comfort, It was about maintaining mental health when storms raged for days without stopping. Wind protection wasn't a one-time construction project. It was an ongoing winter survival task that required constant attention and adjustment throughout the cold months. Of course, all these wind defenses were meaningless if families couldn't stay dry, because wet clothing in Viking winters was essentially a death sentence waiting to happen. Moisture was the silent killer of the Viking winter. You could have all the furs, wool and firewood in the world, but if you got soaked through, you were basically signing your own death warrant. The Vikings knew this brutal truth better than anyone. When snow melted on your clothes from body heat, then refroze against your skin, hypothermia wasn't far behind. Even inside their longhouses, Vikings had to wage constant war against dampness creeping in through every crack and crevice. Water found ways to sneak inside that would make a modern engineer scratch their head. The hearth became more than just a heat source. It transformed into a drying station that never slept. Wet mittens, soaked boots and damp cloaks hung from every available hook and beam around the fire. Families developed intricate rotation systems for drying gear. Your outer layer went closest to the flames, while slightly damp items waited their turn further back. The whole longhouse often looked like a medieval laundromat. But here's where Viking ingenuity really shined. They discovered that wool kept you warm even when wet. Unlike other materials that became useless dead weight, wool fibers trapped air pockets that provided insulation regardless of moisture content. This wasn't scientific knowledge back then, just hard-earned survival wisdom passed down through generations of frozen ancestors. Leather boots presented their own challenge. Wet leather became stiff as a board and about as comfortable as wearing tree bark on your feet. Vikings learned to rub animal fat into their boots regularly, creating a waterproof barrier that kept moisture out. Bear grease worked particularly well, though getting bear grease meant someone had to actually kill a bear first. Not exactly a trip to the corner store. Then there's the problem nobody talks about: sweating inside all those layers. Physical work in heavy winter clothing created moisture from within. Vikings couldn't just strip down to cool off when temperatures outside hovered around deadly. They learned to work in bursts, warming up by the fire between tasks to let sweat evaporate before it froze against their skin. Snow that melted inside the longhouse created another headache entirely. Kids tracking in snow on their boots, adults shaking it off their cloaks, or snow blowing through door openings. It all had to go somewhere. Vikings swept melting snow back outside immediately, before it could soak into sleeping areas or stored supplies. Wet bedding in winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a recipe for sickness that could kill entire families. Women developed clever tricks for keeping bedding dry. They heated stones by the fire, wrapped them in cloth, and tucked them into beds before anyone climbed in. The heated stones drove out any moisture that might have accumulated during the day while warming the sleeping space. These medieval hot water bottles made the difference between restful sleep and shivering misery. Clothing repairs became critical when everything had to stay dry. A torn seam in your cloak meant snow could get inside and melt against your body. Viking women spent countless hours by firelight, stitching up every small hole or weak spot in winter garments. One loose thread could literally be the thread between life and death. The really smart Vikings learned to read weather signs that warned of incoming moisture. Certain cloud formations meant sleet instead of snow. Wind patterns indicated when storms would bring wet, heavy snow rather than dry powder. Getting caught in wet weather far from home turned routine trips into survival ordeals. Well, staying dry wasn't just about comfort, it determined who lived to see spring and who didn't. Frostbite attacked wet skin faster than dry skin. Infections spread more easily in damp conditions. Even minor cuts became serious problems when constantly exposed to moisture and cold. Viking families created designated wet zones near their entrances where soggy outer clothing could drip without damaging stored food or sleeping areas. These spaces had drainage systems that channeled melted snow away from living spaces. Smart architecture prevented water damage before it started. Makes sense that they also developed early warning systems for moisture problems. If someone's breath started freezing inside the longhouse, it meant humidity levels were getting dangerous. Too much moisture in the air could cause condensation problems that soaked everything they owned. The constant battle against wetness shaped Viking daily routines in ways most people never consider. Every outdoor task had to account for staying dry. Every piece of equipment needed protection from moisture. Every family member learned to spot the early signs of dampness before it became deadly. But the Vikings weren't just fighting moisture from snow and rain. Underground springs, roof leaks, and even their own breathing created water problems that required constant attention. Managing moisture became as important as managing food supplies or firewood stockpiles. However, staying dry was only part of surviving winter's deadly embrace. Even the driest Viking still faced another crucial challenge that could mean the difference between making it to spring, finding enough water to actually drink. When temperatures drop to bone-chilling levels and everything around you starts turning into ice, your body's need for water doesn't magically disappear. Vikings faced a brutal reality every winter morning. Their water sources had turned solid as stone overnight. Picture walking outside at dawn to find your usual stream locked under inches of thick ice. The gentle babbling water that flowed freely just months before now looked like a frozen highway. Vikings had to break through this icy barrier every single day, often using heavy axes or iron tools to crack through layers that rebuilt themselves each night. The work was exhausting, especially when you're already fighting to stay warm. But here's where it gets tricky. Simply breaking ice wasn't enough during the worst cold snaps. Some winters hit so hard that even deep streams froze completely solid, leaving families scrambling for alternatives. That's when the real survival skills kicked in. Snow became their backup water source, but melting it required precious fuel from their carefully rationed firewood supplies. Vikings learned to pack snow tightly into iron pots and position them close to their hearth fires. The melting process took time and constant attention. Let the pot get too hot and you'd waste fuel; too cool, and you'd wait forever for enough water to drink. Then there's the storage problem. Water left sitting in wooden bowls or containers would freeze solid within hours during the harshest months. Smart Viking families kept water barrels inside their homes, positioned close enough to the central fire to prevent freezing but not so close that the wood would crack from heat expansion. These indoor water stores became lifelines during week-long blizzards when venturing outside meant risking your life. Wells presented their own winter challenges. Families who had dug deep wells during warmer months found themselves in constant battles against ice formation. They'd cover well openings with thick wooden planks and pile animal hides on top for insulation. Even then, the top layer of water often froze, requiring daily ice-breaking sessions just to reach the liquid water below. Well, the Vikings discovered something interesting about different types of water sources. Moving water, like fast-flowing streams, stayed liquid longer than still ponds or shallow wells. They learned to identify spots where underground springs kept water flowing, even in brutal cold. These locations became precious community resources that multiple families would share and collectively protect throughout winter. But why did staying hydrated matter so much when they were already fighting cold and hunger? Dehydration in winter was actually more dangerous than many people realized. Cold air is incredibly dry, and Vikings were constantly losing moisture through their breath and skin. Add in the physical demands of chopping wood, tending fires, and caring for livestock, and their bodies needed steady water intake to function properly. The weird part is how they rationed water alongside their food supplies. Unlike summer months when water seemed endless, winter forced families to treat every drop as valuable as their stored grain. They'd melt just enough snow for immediate needs, carefully measuring portions to ensure their fuel supplies lasted until spring thaw. Vikings also figured out creative ways to capture and store water during brief warm spells. When winter temperatures occasionally rose above freezing, they'd position every container they owned outside to catch melting snow and ice. These water collection days became family events, with everyone pitching in to gather as much liquid as possible before the next freeze hit. Let's not forget the daily routine this created. Someone, usually the older children or youngest adults, had to venture out every morning to break ice and collect water before the household could start their day. This person became the family's water guardian, responsible for keeping everyone hydrated and alive. During the absolute worst storms, when going outside meant certain death, families relied entirely on their indoor water stores and whatever snow had blown through cracks in their walls. These emergency situations taught Vikings to always keep extra water reserves, even when it meant sacrificing precious indoor space. The quality of their water sources also mattered more in winter. Stagnant water that froze and thawed repeatedly could become unsafe to drink. Vikings learned to prefer fresh snow over questionable ice, even though melting snow required more fuel. Clean water meant healthy families, and healthy families had better chances of surviving until spring. Makes sense, right? Water wasn't just about quenching thirst, it was essential for cooking their survival stews, cleaning wounds, and maintaining basic hygiene during months of indoor living. Their water management skills developed into sophisticated systems passed down through generations. Each family knew exactly how much water they needed daily, which sources stayed liquid longest, and how to stretch their supplies during extended cold snaps. But securing water was just one piece of the winter survival puzzle. The long nights brought their own unique challenges that tested Viking endurance in completely different ways. The sun barely crawled above the horizon for most of the Scandinavian winter. When it did appear, it hung low like a pale ghost, offering little more than a dim orange glow before disappearing again. In the far north, some Viking settlements experienced what we'd call polar night weeks, where the sun never rose at all. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It completely rewired how families lived their daily lives. Most Vikings abandoned the idea of normal schedules during the darkest months. Why wake up at dawn when dawn lasted 20 hours? Instead, they created routines around the fire and the needs of their animals. Cows still needed milking twice a day, but that might happen at what we'd consider 2 in the afternoon and 2 in the morning. The weird part is how quickly children adapted to this upside-down world. Kids who had never known anything different would play games by flickering firelight, learning to recognize faces and objects in dim, dancing shadows. They developed an almost supernatural ability to navigate their homes in near-total darkness. Parents often marveled at how their youngest could find stored food or locate tools without any visible light source. But the psychological toll was real. Vikings didn't have a word for what we now call seasonal affective disorder, but they definitely experienced it. Adults became sluggish, irritable, and sometimes deeply melancholy during the darkest weeks. The constant darkness felt oppressive, like living inside a cave for months. Smart families fought back against this winter depression in clever ways. They positioned their hearths to cast maximum light throughout the main living space. Polished metal pieces, bronze shields, silver arm rings, even well-maintained weapons were strategically placed to reflect and amplify whatever light existed. The result was a warm golden glow that pushed back against the suffocating darkness outside. Then there's the issue of work scheduling. Traditional farming tasks obviously stopped when everything froze solid. Vikings couldn't plow, plant, or harvest in 2 feet of snow. Instead, winter became the season of indoor productivity. This was when the year's major craft projects happened: weapon forging, intricate wood carving, textile weaving, and leather working. Women often worked in shifts around the fire, taking advantage of the light for detailed needlework or spinning. One woman might weave for several hours while others prepared food or tended children, then they'd rotate. This system kept the household productive even when natural light disappeared for weeks at a time. The lack of daylight also changed how Vikings measured time itself. Rather than tracking hours by the sun's position, they measured periods by how much firewood burned or how many specific tasks got completed. A morning might be defined as the time it took to milk the animals and prepare the day's first meal, regardless of whether the sun was visible. Sleep patterns became wildly different from what we consider normal. Many families adopted what historians call segmented sleep, sleeping for a few hours after dark, waking in the middle of the night for several hours of quiet activity, then sleeping again until the animals needed attention. This actually worked well with the need to maintain fires constantly. Someone was always awake to add wood and keep the hearth burning. Children learned to tell stories, play memory games, and practice practical skills during these middle-of-the-night wake periods. Parents used this time for intimate conversations, planning, or working on projects that required concentration. It wasn't considered strange or disruptive, it was just how winter life worked. The absence of natural light made Vikings incredibly efficient with their artificial lighting sources. Candles and oil lamps weren't casually burned, they were precious resources that needed careful management. Families developed elaborate systems for maximizing light output while minimizing fuel consumption. One common technique involved using reflective surfaces behind light sources to double their effectiveness. A single tallow candle placed in front of a polished metal bowl could light an area twice as large as the same candle burning alone. Some households created primitive light schedules, moving their limited number of candles from room to room as different activities required illumination. The endless darkness also strengthened family bonds in unexpected ways. When there's nothing to see outside and limited light inside, people naturally gathered closer together. Conversations became longer and more meaningful. Children learned family histories, traditional songs, and practical skills through hours of close interaction with parents and grandparents. All makes sense, right? When entertainment options are limited to what you can do by firelight, Talking becomes the primary pastime. These long winter conversations preserved Viking culture, passing down stories, values, and practical knowledge that might otherwise have been forgotten. Well, as challenging as the darkness was, Vikings discovered that mastering artificial light and adapted schedules was only part of winter survival. The real test came when the youngest family members needed special protection from the brutal cold, and keeping children alive required strategies that went far beyond what adults needed. Viking children weren't exactly getting bedtime stories about princesses in cozy castles. Their reality, learning to survive brutal winters that could kill them before their 5th birthday. These weren't modern kids complaining about cold classrooms, they were tiny humans facing months of darkness, howling winds, and temperatures that would make a polar bear think twice. The youngest Vikings faced the harshest challenge of all. Babies born in autumn had to survive their first winter wrapped in layer after layer of wool and fur. Mothers knew that one mistake could mean losing their child. They'd bundle infants so thoroughly that only tiny faces peeked out from cocoons of animal skins. Think medieval sleeping bags, but the stakes were life or death. Toddlers presented their own unique problems. They couldn't understand why they suddenly couldn't play outside for months. Parents had to create invisible leashes of fear, not cruel fear, but the healthy kind that keeps curious 2-year-olds from wandering into blizzards. One family rule dominated everything else: nobody goes outside alone, ever. Well, except this rule created its own complications. Children spent months cooped up in smoky longhouses with parents, grandparents, siblings, and sometimes extended family. Imagine being stuck in a one-room cabin with 8 other people for half a year. The patience required was almost superhuman. Games became survival training disguised as fun. Viking parents weren't running elaborate entertainment programs, they were teaching life skills through play. Children learned to identify different types of wood by touch, crucial for keeping fires burning properly. They practiced tying knots that would secure loads on sleds or repair torn clothing. Memory games helped them remember which plants were safe to eat when spring finally arrived. Then there were the daily responsibilities that fell on small shoulders. Children as young as 6 carried water from wells, helped tend animals, and gathered kindling. Not because their parents were harsh, but because every pair of hands mattered when survival hung in the balance. These weren't chores, they were contributions to keeping the family alive. The older kids, around 10 or 12, took on genuinely dangerous tasks. Boys learned to break ice on frozen streams, risking falls that could mean hypothermia or drowning. Girls helped preserve food and manage cooking fires, where one mistake could burn down the only shelter protecting their family from the elements. But here's what's fascinating. Viking children weren't miserable little survivors trudging through childhood. They found joy in the strangest places. Ice became their playground when it was thick enough. Snow turned into building material for forts and sculptures. The long nights became storytelling marathons, where kids learned about heroes, monsters, and gods. Let's not forget the educational system happening around those hearth fires. Children absorbed practical knowledge that modern survival experts would pay thousands to learn. They understood weather patterns, animal behavior, and resource management before they could write their own names. Every winter was like attending the world's most intense survival academy. The really young ones faced the most precarious situation. Infants and toddlers couldn't regulate their body temperature effectively. Parents had to become human thermostats, constantly monitoring their children's warmth. Cold hands meant immediate action, rubbing circulation back, adding layers, moving closer to the fire. Sleep presented constant challenges. Families couldn't afford separate bedrooms for children. Everyone huddled together for warmth. Kids learned to sleep through snoring, crying babies, and the occasional argument between adults who'd been trapped together for months. Privacy was a luxury that could literally freeze you to death. And the weird part is how quickly children adapted to this lifestyle. Modern kids might complain about losing internet for a few hours, but Viking children accepted months without sunlight as normal life. They developed incredible patience, resourcefulness, and resilience that shaped their entire worldview. The psychological impact was profound. Children who survived multiple harsh winters emerged with unshakable confidence in their ability to handle adversity. They'd already faced down the worst nature could throw at them and lived to tell the tale. This created a generation of adults who viewed most challenges as manageable problems rather than insurmountable obstacles. Discipline took on different meanings during winter months. Parents couldn't send misbehaving children outside to cool off. That could be a death sentence. Instead, they developed creative indoor consequences that maintained order without risking lives. The threat of reduced blankets or sleeping farther from the fire proved remarkably effective. Yet somehow, children still managed to be children. They created games from scraps of wood, competed in indoor contests, and found ways to annoy their siblings, even in cramped quarters. The human spirit's ability to find lightness in dark circumstances never stops being remarkable. These young Vikings weren't just surviving winter, they were absorbing lessons about cooperation, resourcefulness, and resilience that would serve them throughout their lives. But raising children successfully was only part of the winter challenge. Trade and commerce somehow continued even in the depths of the coldest months, creating opportunities and dangers that most people never imagine. Winter didn't shut down Viking commerce completely. Sure, most people think ancient trade ground to a halt when snow started flying, but Vikings were tougher than that. They found ways to keep goods moving, even when temperatures dropped below freezing and roads disappeared under feet of snow. Sledds became the backbone of winter commerce. These weren't your kid's Christmas sled either. Viking sleds were serious pieces of equipment, built heavy and sturdy enough to haul massive loads across frozen ground. They carved runners from hardwood and reinforced them with iron when they could get it. The sled bed stretched long enough to carry everything from grain sacks to iron tools, and sometimes even livestock. Then there's the matter of frozen waterways. Rivers that blocked summer travel became winter highways once they froze solid. Vikings tested ice thickness with long poles, tapping and listening for the right sound that meant safe passage. A good frozen river could support loaded sleds, people on skis, and even small boats dragged across the ice surface. But who exactly was crazy enough to travel in these conditions? Merchants who dealt in luxury goods, that's who. Salt commanded premium prices in winter, because preserved meat meant survival. Honey was liquid gold when fresh food ran out. Furs and amber attracted buyers willing to pay triple summer rates. These weren't everyday purchases, they were lifelines. The most valuable winter commodity was iron. Tools broke constantly in freezing weather, and replacement metal could mean the difference between fixing a plow in spring or facing crop failure. Viking smiths hoarded iron all winter, then charged desperate farmers whatever the market would bear come planting season. While traveling merchants faced risks that would terrify modern delivery drivers. Blizzards struck without warning, turning familiar routes into death traps. Wolves grew bolder in winter, following the scent of food supplies. River ice could crack and swallow entire sleds in minutes. More than one trader set out with valuable cargo, and simply vanished until spring thaw revealed their fate. Smart merchants traveled in groups when possible. Safety in numbers wasn't just about wolves and bandits, it was about survival itself. If one sled broke down or someone got injured, the group could redistribute loads and keep everyone alive. Solo travelers who got caught in storms rarely made it home to tell the story. Communication networks somehow kept functioning too. Messages traveled along trade routes, carried by whoever was heading in the right direction. News about deaths, births, marriages, and political changes moved slowly but steadily through winter settlements. A merchant might arrive with salt and leave carrying word that the jarl's daughter was getting married come spring. Some communities developed clever seasonal arrangements. Merchants would arrive before the worst weather hit and essentially hibernate with host families through the darkest months. They'd trade their goods for food and shelter, then continue their journey when conditions improved. These arrangements built lasting relationships that lasted generations. The really dedicated traders pushed even further north, where winter lasted 8 months and darkness swallowed entire weeks. Up there they traded with people who lived differently than southern Vikings, folks who hunted seals, carved walrus ivory, and wore nothing but fur from head to toe. The goods they brought back commanded incredible prices: white fox pelts, walrus tusks, and strange stories of lands where ice never melted. Local trade thrived too. Families who prepared well often had surplus goods their neighbors desperately needed. A household with extra grain might trade for preserved fish or additional firewood. Women swapped wool yarn for honey, or traded preserved vegetables for meat. These small exchanges kept entire communities functioning when larger supply networks failed. Ice fishing created its own mini-economy. Skilled fishermen who could consistently catch fish through frozen water became valuable community members. Fresh fish in the dead of winter was worth its weight in silver, and smart fishermen could trade their catches for everything from tools to textiles. Even debt collection continued in winter, though it required serious commitment. Vikings took their obligations seriously, and creditors would ski long distances to collect what they were owed. Winter travel for debt collection sent a strong message about how seriously someone took their reputation. The strangest part: some merchants actually preferred winter travel, Frozen ground eliminated mud that could trap heavy carts. Snow provided smooth surfaces for sleds that moved easier than wheeled vehicles over rough terrain. Rivers became bridges instead of barriers. For traders with the right equipment and enough courage, winter opened routes that summer made impassable. But winter commerce came with one major limitation: timing. Miss the narrow windows of acceptable traveling weather, and you'd wait weeks for the next opportunity. This created a boom and bust cycle where goods would flood small settlements during brief good weather periods, then disappear completely during the worst storms. Understanding these trade rhythms was crucial for survival, because families needed to balance their immediate needs against uncertain future opportunities. But even more challenging than managing trade was maintaining the spiritual practices that gave Vikings strength during their darkest months. When darkness stretched for 20 hours a day, and the wind howled like angry spirits, Vikings didn't just worry about staying warm, they worried about staying right with the gods. Religion wasn't some Sunday morning thing for these people. It was woven into every frozen breath, every crackle of the hearth, every desperate prayer that spring would actually return. The long winter nights made everyone think about bigger questions. What if the sun never came back? What if this was the winter that never ended? All winter rituals started before the worst cold hit. Families would gather outside their longhouses in late autumn, making offerings to ensure divine protection through the brutal months ahead. They'd pour ale into the earth, hoping it would freeze, and carry their prayers down to the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree that held everything together. Makes sense when you think about it. If you're about to spend 6 months trapped in a wooden box with your entire extended family, you want all the supernatural help you can get. The woods around Viking settlements weren't just collections of trees during winter, they were sacred spaces, home to spirits that could make or break a family's survival. Women especially took charge of these forest offerings, trudging through knee-deep snow to leave bread, meat, or precious bits of metal at certain trees or stones. These weren't random spots either. Generations of families had used the same offering places, creating invisible maps of sacred sites that only the locals knew. But here's where it gets really interesting. The most important winter celebration wasn't some somber, fearful ceremony. It was Yule, and it was basically the ancestor of every winter holiday we know today. Yule lasted for 12 days, usually starting around the winter solstice when the nights were at their longest. This wasn't just a party though, it was a calculated psychological survival strategy disguised as religious celebration. Think about it. Right when everyone was most depressed, most scared, most likely to give up, the community came together for the biggest feast of the year. Families would burn massive logs called Yule logs, specially selected to burn for days without going out. The fire wasn't just for warmth, it was a symbol that light and life could survive even the darkest times. Kids would stay up all night watching the flames, listening to stories that had been passed down for generations. Adults would drink ale and mead they'd been saving all year, temporarily forgetting their worries about whether the food would last until spring. Women played the starring role in most winter religious ceremonies. While men might handle the outdoor hunting and wood gathering, women were the spiritual leaders inside the longhouse. They knew which runes to carve for protection, which herbs to burn for purification, which songs to sing to keep evil spirits away from sleeping children. Ancient runes weren't just pretty symbols either. During the longest nights, experienced women would cast rune stones by firelight, reading patterns that supposedly predicted when winter would break. These readings became community events, with neighbors crowding into the warmest longhouse to hear what the stones revealed. Or whether the predictions were accurate didn't really matter. What mattered was giving people hope, and something to focus on besides their shrinking food supplies. Then, there were the ancestor spirits. Vikings believed their dead relatives were still around, especially during winter when the boundary between worlds grew thin. Families would set extra places at their tables during winter feasts, pour drinks for grandparents who'd died years before, and tell stories about heroic ancestors who'd survived even worse winters. This wasn't creepy, it was comforting. Nobody was truly alone when surrounded by generations of survivors. The weird part is how practical all this spiritual stuff actually was. Community religious gatherings meant people checked on each other's welfare. Sharing stories reinforced survival knowledge. Ritual feasting used up perishable foods before they spoiled. Even the offerings to forest spirits served a purpose. They were often placed along hunting trails, creating a network of landmarks that could guide lost hunters back to safety. Some winter rituals were specifically about driving away the darkness. Families would light every candle they had during certain ceremonies, filling their longhouses with more light than they'd see for weeks afterward. They'd make noise with horns, drums, and shouting to scare off evil spirits that supposedly grew stronger during the polar nights. Modern psychologists would probably call this light therapy and stress relief. Religious faith during Viking winters wasn't about blind belief. It was about creating structure, hope, and community bonds strong enough to survive months of isolation and hardship. When everything else seemed uncertain, at least the rituals stayed the same. But even the strongest faith couldn't prevent the worst-case scenario that haunted every Viking family's nightmares. Sometimes, despite all the prayers, offerings, and careful preparation, the food simply ran out before spring returned. Even the most prepared Viking families faced their worst nightmare: famine years. These weren't just harsh winters, they were survival nightmares that tested everything they thought they knew about making it through the cold months. When crops failed in summer or autumn arrived early with killing frosts, families knew they were in serious trouble. The carefully calculated food stores that usually lasted 6 months might only stretch 3 or 4. Every grain of barley became precious. Every strip of dried meat had to be rationed like gold. The math was brutal and simple. A typical Viking family needed about 2 tons of food to survive winter. When harvests failed, they might have half that amount. What do you do when the numbers just don't add up? Smart families started rationing immediately, even before the snow fell. Instead of 3 meals a day, they dropped to 2, then 1 substantial meal with maybe some thin gruel or broth later. Children got priority, their growing bodies needed fuel more than adults. But even kids learned to go to bed hungry during famine winters. Then there's the psychological torture of watching your food supplies dwindle. Viking mothers would count every remaining fish, every last turnip in the root cellar. They'd calculate and recalculate, hoping somehow the math would work out differently. It never did. Desperate times called for desperate hunting. Men would venture out in weather that would normally keep them indoors. Blizzards, dangerous ice, wolves, nothing mattered when your family was slowly starving. They'd track any animal, no matter how small. Mice, birds, even tree bark became potential food sources. Some families resorted to eating their seed grain, the precious stores meant for next year's planting. This created a terrible choice: starve now, or potentially starve next year too. Many took the gamble, figuring they had to survive this winter before worrying about the next growing season. The social fabric of communities changed during famine years. Neighbors who normally helped each other started hoarding what little they had. Trust eroded when survival was at stake. Stories tell of families barricading their doors, afraid that desperate neighbors might try to steal their remaining food. But the weird part is how some communities pulled together instead of falling apart. Villages would pool their remaining resources, creating communal soup kitchens where thin gruel was shared equally among everyone. These shared meals weren't much, mostly water with whatever scraps could be found, but they kept people alive. Trading became frantic and unbalanced during famine winters. Families would trade valuable jewelry, weapons, even family heirlooms for just a few days' worth of food. A silver arm ring that took months to earn might buy 1 dried fish. The exchange rates were brutal, but what choice did they have? Children learned harsh lessons during these winters that they'd carry for life. They watched parents make impossible choices about who got the last piece of bread. They saw strong adults grow thin and weak. These experiences shaped entire generations of Vikings, who became obsessively careful about food preparation. Some families tried stretching their food by mixing it with inedible materials. Sawdust got mixed into what little flour remained. Tree bark was ground up and added to stews. These additions provided bulk but little nutrition, creating the illusion of fuller stomachs while bodies slowly weakened from malnutrition. The death toll during famine winters was devastating. Elderly family members often died first. Their bodies couldn't handle the combination of cold and hunger. Infants were next most vulnerable. Entire family lines could disappear during the worst years, leaving empty longhouses as grim reminders. Famine winters also created waves of desperate migration. Families would abandon their homes and travel to areas rumored to have better food supplies. These winter journeys were incredibly dangerous, but staying put meant certain starvation. Many died on these desperate travels, but some found salvation with more fortunate relatives or communities. The psychological effects lasted long after the food returned. Vikings who survived famine winters became legendary hoarders, always keeping extra supplies just in case. They'd tell and retell their survival stories, passing down hard-earned wisdom about rationing, emergency foods, and the importance of community cooperation. Women often emerged as the heroes of famine winters. They were typically in charge of food distribution and had to make the daily decisions about who ate what. Their ability to stretch mega supplies and keep families alive through careful rationing often meant the difference between survival and death. Recovery from famine years took multiple seasons. Even after food became available again, families remained weakened and vulnerable. The next winter preparations became even more intense, driven by fresh memories of near starvation. These harsh experiences explain why Viking culture placed such enormous emphasis on hospitality and sharing food with guests. When you've faced starvation, feeding others becomes a sacred duty. But surviving famine was just one piece of their winter puzzle. When spring finally returned, families had to rebuild not just their food stores, but their entire lives from the ground up. After months of bone-chilling cold, darkness that seemed to swallow entire days, and the constant battle against freezing winds, Viking families finally started seeing the signs they'd been desperately waiting for. The first hint wasn't dramatic, just a tiny drip from the roof edge, where ice had begun its slow surrender to warmer air. But that single drop, it meant everything. Spring didn't announce itself with fanfare in Scandinavia. Instead, it whispered its arrival through subtle changes that only people who'd survived brutal winters could recognize. The snow that had been rock-hard for months started developing a softer crust. Icicles hanging from roof lines grew longer during the day, then shortened again at night. Most telling of all, the relentless wind that had howled around their homes for half the year finally began to calm. Viking children, who'd been cooped up indoors for what felt like forever, were often the first to notice these changes. They'd press their faces against tiny windows or peek through door cracks, watching for any sign that their outdoor world might return. When parents finally allowed them brief ventures outside, their excited shouts echoed across settlements that had been eerily quiet for months. The thaw brought immediate relief, but it also created new challenges. Melting snow turned the ground into a muddy mess that made walking treacherous. Streams that had been frozen solid suddenly roared back to life, sometimes flooding areas that had been safe pathways all winter. Roofs designed to hold massive snow loads now had to deal with water seeping through joints and seams. Then there were the animals. Cows, sheep and goats that had been sharing barn space with their human families for months could finally venture outside again. These creatures seemed to sense the changing season even before humans did. They'd become restless, making more noise and moving around their confined spaces with renewed energy. Getting them back outdoors required careful timing though. Too early, and a surprise cold snap could kill them. Viking families approached the thaw with mixed emotions. Relief dominated everything else, naturally. The constant worry about running out of firewood or food could finally ease. But spring also meant acknowledging which neighbors hadn't made it through the harsh months. Empty longhouses told silent stories of families who'd lost their battle against the elements. What's fascinating is how quickly communities sprang back to life once the worst cold broke. People who'd been isolated in their homes for months suddenly emerged, eager to reconnect with neighbors and share their winter experiences. These reunions often revealed surprising stories: who'd had the most creative solutions to heating problems, which families had discovered new recipes for preserved foods, or what children had learnt during the long indoor months. The returning sunlight had an almost magical effect on everyone's energy levels. After months of living by firelight and struggling through days that barely qualified as daylight, having the sun stay visible for more than a few hours felt like a gift from the gods. Viking families would literally follow patches of sunlight around their homes, moving their activities to stay in the warming rays. But the thaw wasn't just about comfort. It was about survival preparation starting all over again. Smart Viking families knew that spring's arrival meant immediately beginning preparations for the next winter. This might seem exhausting to us, but for them, it was simply reality. They'd learned that winter survival started the moment the previous winter ended. Repairs became urgent priorities. Roofs damaged by heavy snow loads needed immediate attention before spring rains made things worse. Tools that had broken during winter required fixing before the busy growing season began. Clothing worn thin by months of constant use had to be mended or replaced. The psychological impact of spring's return cannot be overstated. Modern research shows that lack of sunlight can cause serious depression, and Vikings certainly experienced this phenomenon. When longer days returned, families reported feeling more optimistic, energetic, and hopeful. Children who'd been quiet and subdued during the darkest months suddenly became active and playful again. Streams flowing freely meant fresh water without the daily chore of melting snow. This simple change freed up enormous amounts of time and fuel that had been devoted to water collection during winter. Women could finally wash clothes properly again. and families could drink water that didn't taste like smoke from being melted over fires. The first green shoots pushing through remaining snow patches created genuine excitement. After months of seeing only white, brown and black, any hint of green felt like a miracle. Children would compete to spot the first wildflowers, and adults would carefully note which plants were emerging where. But even as families celebrated winter's retreat, they couldn't completely relax. Spring brought its own dangers and challenges that required different but equally important survival skills. The transition between seasons demanded just as much careful planning and preparation as surviving winter itself, and those lessons would prove crucial as Viking families moved from simply surviving to actively preparing for the productive months ahead. Or when spring finally arrived and Viking families stepped back into the sunlight, they didn't just celebrate, they immediately started planning for the next winter. Makes sense, right? You'd remember every frozen toe, every night when the fire almost went out, every moment when the food stores looked dangerously low. The smart families held what we might call winter reviews. They sat around their hearths and honestly discussed what went wrong. Did they run out of firewood in February? Well, next summer they'd gather twice as much. Was the roof leaking melted snow onto their sleeping area? Time to add more turf layers before the next cold season hit. Children were the best teachers in these discussions. They remembered everything, how their mittens got soaked through, how the wind found every gap in the walls, how boring it got when they ran out of indoor games. Adults might forget details, but kids, they held grudges against every uncomfortable moment. Their complaints became next year's improvement projects. Then there was the matter of food storage. Families who nearly starved would dig additional root cellars before summer ended. They'd build better smokehouses for preserving meat. Some even started keeping detailed mental notes about which preservation methods worked best. That dried fish that lasted until March, they'd make twice as much. The salted pork that went bad in January. Time to try a different technique. Tool repairs became another major focus. Broken snow shovels, cracked wooden bowls, torn clothing. Everything that failed during the harsh months got attention. Men would spend early spring crafting better versions of everything that let them down. A splitting axe handle that cracked in the cold meant switching to a different type of wood. Boots that leaked meant learning better waterproofing methods. But the lessons weren't just practical, they were deeply personal. Families learned which personality conflicts got worse during long indoor months. They figured out who needed more personal space, who got cranky without enough light, who required extra attention during the darkest weeks. These insights shaped how they'd arrange their living spaces the following winter. The weird part is how much these survival lessons became family wisdom passed down for generations. Grandparents would tell stories not just for entertainment, but as detailed survival manuals. Remember the winter when your great-uncle Eric didn't stack enough wood? He spent February burning furniture to stay warm. These weren't just stories, they were warnings. Let's not forget how much Vikings learned about weather prediction. After surviving multiple winters, families became incredibly good at reading natural signs. They'd notice which animals behaved differently before, especially harsh seasons. They'd track which cloud patterns meant extended cold snaps were coming. This knowledge helped them prepare more accurately each year. Some families even started keeping physical reminders of their winter struggles. A broken tool might get hung on the wall as a reminder to make better preparations. Children's outgrown winter clothes were saved to show exactly how much extra material was needed for growing kids. These weren't decorations, they were survival guides. Community preparation changed too. Villages that struggled with winter isolation would plan better communication systems. Maybe they'd establish regular check-in schedules with neighbors. Perhaps they'd organize group hunting expeditions or shared food storage projects. The villages that thrived understood that winter survival was often a team effort. Women particularly focused on improving their textile production. If the family ran short of warm clothing, the solution was starting earlier and working more efficiently. They'd plan out exactly how much wool they needed to spin, how many hours of weaving were required, how much extra material to account for repairs and growth. Winter taught them that you could never have too much warm clothing. Storage innovations came from necessity too. Families who lost food to rodents or moisture would design better containers and hiding spots. They'd experiment with different preservation techniques, trying new combinations of salt, smoke, and drying. Every failed meal became knowledge for the next season. The most successful Viking families treated winter preparation like a year-round project. Spring meant evaluating what went wrong. Summer meant gathering and creating solutions. Fall meant final preparations based on lessons learned. Winter became the test of how well they'd applied their knowledge. And here's what made Vikings truly remarkable. They didn't just survive these lessons, they shared them. Knowledge about winter survival spread through communities, creating collective wisdom that helped everyone live through the harsh months more successfully. But even with all this careful planning and learning, Vikings knew they were still at nature's mercy. No amount of preparation could guarantee survival when the weather turned truly brutal. Their winter survival legacy was built not just on smart planning, but on the incredible courage to face the unknown season after season. When the last Viking longship disappeared over the horizon, their winter survival secrets didn't vanish with them. These techniques spread across generations like smoke from their hearth fires. The knowledge passed from parent to child, neighbor to neighbor, creating a legacy that would outlast empires. Modern Scandinavians still stack firewood the same way their ancestors did 1,000 years ago. They angle the logs to let air flow through, keeping everything dry and ready to burn. Walk through any Norwegian village today, and you'll see wood piles that look identical to those Viking families built. The method works too well to abandon. That thick wool clothing, still the gold standard in Nordic countries. While the rest of the world chases synthetic materials, Scandinavians trust the same sheep fleece that kept their ancestors alive. Norwegian fishermen wear wool sweaters that use patterns passed down through 40 generations. The designs haven't changed because they don't need to. Then there's the food preservation methods. Scandinavian kitchens still cure fish the Viking way, hanging cod in the cold air until it becomes stockfish. These dried fish fillets can last for years without refrigeration. Modern hikers and Arctic explorers packed the same type of preserved foods Vikings ate during their darkest winters. But the real treasure isn't in the techniques, it's in the mindset. Vikings approached winter like a chess match, thinking 20 moves ahead. They understood that survival wasn't about being tough when things got bad. It was about being smart when things were still good. This planning mentality shaped entire cultures. Scandinavian societies became famous for their long-term thinking, their careful resource management, their willingness to sacrifice today for tomorrow's benefit. Modern Nordic social systems, with their emphasis on preparation and community support, echo those Viking winter strategies. And the weird part is how their survival stories traveled far beyond Scandinavia. When Vikings explored Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, they carried these winter techniques with them. Inuit peoples learned new hunting methods from Viking contact. Early American settlers adopted Viking-style root cellars and food preservation. The influence spread through trade networks too. Medieval European merchants observed Viking winter preparations and brought the ideas home. Soon, castle builders across Europe were copying Viking heating systems, using central hearths and smoke holes. Wool became the preferred winter fabric from Scotland to Russia. Let's not forget how these stories inspired later explorers. When Roald Amundsen reached the South Pole, he studied Viking accounts of winter survival. Ernest Shackleton's Antarctic expeditions used techniques borrowed directly from thousand-year-old Norse sagas. They knew Vikings had already solved the puzzle of staying alive in impossible cold. Modern military forces still teach Viking-inspired winter warfare tactics. Special operations units learn to build snow shelters using principles Vikings developed. They study how Viking warriors moved across frozen landscapes, how they maintained equipment in sub-zero temperatures, how they kept morale high during months of darkness. Hollywood discovered these stories too, but they usually get it wrong. Movies show Vikings as wild barbarians charging into battle. The real story is more impressive. They were survival engineers who conquered winter itself. Their greatest victory wasn't over any enemy army, it was over the most dangerous opponent of all, the Scandinavian winter. Well, the storytelling tradition survived as well. Those long winter nights filled with sagas and legends created a culture of oral history that still thrives. Modern Scandinavian literature, with its dark themes and survival stories, carries echoes of Viking winter tales. Writers like Knut Hamsun and Selma Lagerlöf drew inspiration from these ancient survival narratives. The community cooperation that kept Viking families alive evolved into the Nordic social model. Countries like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark became famous for their collective approach to challenges. Citizens willingly pay high taxes because they understand the Viking lesson. Individual survival depends on group preparation. But here's what's truly remarkable. These winter survival skills are becoming relevant again. Climate scientists predict more extreme weather patterns, longer power outages, supply chain disruptions. Suddenly those old Viking techniques don't seem so ancient. People are rediscovering root cellars, wood heating, food preservation, community cooperation. Urban preppers study Viking methods for storing water, maintaining heat without electricity, keeping food fresh without refrigeration. Homesteading communities embrace Viking building techniques, using earth and wood for natural insulation. The knowledge that once meant the difference between life and death in medieval Scandinavia now offers solutions for modern emergencies. The spirit of those long winter nights lives on too. When modern families gather around fireplaces, sharing stories and games during power outages, they're recreating something Vikings perfected centuries ago. They're rediscovering that survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about staying human. Their legacy reminds us that the greatest challenges often produce the greatest innovations. Vikings didn't just survive winter, they mastered it, and taught us that preparation, community and determination can overcome anything.